Hello and welcome everyone. I know it has been quite a while since most of you have seen my face on YouTube, but I am still alive, just quite busy. But today I thought we'd have a nice little impromptu stream to try and make up for that fact, as well as a couple of other things too. So today is just nice and relaxed. It's Q&A, so try and bring some hard science questions because the goal will be to see what I don't know, or if you're curious, maybe I can help you with that. But anyway, it wouldn't be a live stream unless I had other people to join me. And while we're waiting for people to join in the audience, I have a co-host. And it's always, as usual, Jen. Welcome back.
Oh, that sounded great.
I'm not good at this when it's not scripted either, although even if it's scripted, this is still... Anyway.
You did well.
Yes. I hope you've got science questions for me, and I'll try and think of some too for you as well. Although once we get started, the two of us generally
we'll just go
having a problem with that. How have you been recently, Jen?
Well, I've been in hospital recently. For anybody who isn't aware,
hence your background.
Hence my background. That's a get well soon on the window in my room. Yeah, I've been in hospital for 4 weeks now. Probably for another couple of weeks. I've got surgery in the future. I basically got a disease called sarcoidosis, which is an autoimmune disease, and it just means that my immune system is attacking anything it doesn't like in my body, which isn't good. So, yeah, it's caused me to have heart issues and other things. I mean, all treatable. Just it took them a long time to figure out what was going on, and it's going to take a while to get fully well again, but at least it's treatable.
Well, hopefully this can be a bit of a distraction for you, so you got something else to think about for a while. I don't know if we've got anyone in the crowd at the moment, but this is an odd time to start. So
what will happen is the pommies will show up as they get up for breakfast on a Sunday, and then we'll get all those stupid questions.
Well, it depends particularly which ones that join, but some of them I'll probably end up with questions about shark lasers again. But then again, I mean,
definitely
questions about lasers. So what's not to love?
The question is about it. The question is really about lasers. Always.
It's always about lasers. You always need lasers.
Well, if we're going to talk about lasers, let's talk about something interesting that could be done with lasers, and that way, I can start with a question. Because one of the cool things about lasers, and as you know, it was one of the projects I wanted to do when I moved, and I haven't had a chance to because I haven't been well enough. So hopefully after I get over everything, hopefully I can get back to it, was to build a laser measuring device so I could measure the distance to the moon. Yeah, it's complicated because I may have to get a license for the size laser I'm going to need, but we'll see what happens. I may even just build the detecting software and send it to you, Matt, and then you can have a go with it. Or something like that.
Although I am quite close to the big city, so... Oh, no.
Oh, yeah, I'm in a better location.
It'll be outside. Do you know roughly what wavelength you're going to use? I'd assume it'd be infrared.
I haven't. Honestly, I haven't, but I'm thinking when I start doing it, I might make a video series of going through all the process of figuring out what's needed, and I'll drag you in on some of it, so because it's your thing, you like lasers and everything, so I think we could have a lot of fun figuring this out.
I could probably help you with a bit of it, because I use lasers, and I can't actually talk about any of the details, but I'm currently writing a science paper that actually has to do with this, that has a link to astronomy, astrophotonics. But until it's published, I obviously can't get the details for it because, well, it's not published yet. But when it is published, maybe we can bring that up. It doesn't always necessarily involve lasers, that one, but it does have to do with optics and there's a lot of laser related stuff to it. That or the other half of my PhD, I make stuff sing with a laser, which is maybe that's a video I want to make when I submit my thesis. So if you're all wondering why I haven't done a video on what my thesis actually is, there you go. It'll happen when I finish. So that way I could actually give the full story and not part of it and be like, yeah, we're partway through and I have no idea what this is actually meant to do. It'll be, it worked or it didn't. Hopefully hopefully it's the former.
So the question was about the retro reflectors on the moon.
Okay.
So, because they're a brilliant device, you point a light at them and they make sure that the light is coherent on the way back, meaning it travels back on the exact same path it comes in on. So my question for you is, how do they actually make those work?
That's actually a question I have. And as you were saying it, I was like, oh, I actually want to know this answer. Look, if they're they're going to be curved mirrors. I probably have to go actually looking for that one. But if I mean, look, probably it's just geometry at the end of the day, where you actually just have like a surface that's been mathematically calculated. So no matter what angle you hit it, you're going to get reflected at the same angle. So it's going to be curved the way around. Or it's actually one that actually involves several reflections. So the maths actually does that and sends it
ones
back.
I've seen, because you can actually buy these. They're used. Mini retro reflectors are used for some of the door detectors now. So you shine a laser at one end, and as long as you know your lasers hit it, the laser will always come back and hit the detector underneath. So they do make them that way. And the ones like that generally are multifaceted. So yes, you have curves that are designed to reflect back, but there's multiple layers of them. So they're like sections of these sections that are
I would suspect
so you get a multiple bounce usually, not just a singular.
Yeah, because I don't think it would be possible at all angles to do that for a single bounce. So I think it's kind of a combination of my two suspicions. It'll have to be kind of multifaceted. And now that I think about it, I have actually come across chambers that work on this kind of principle, or very similar for the work I do. Because if you're looking for spectroscopy, where you want to see how much, in the case of say absorption, where you're looking at how much light goes missing to pick up the chemical you're looking for, you care about the path length. The longer the light travels through your sample, normally under like traditional techniques means the better resolution you're going to get. So if you want to pick up really small concentrations, you want a long path length. But sometimes if you want to do detection in a room, it's not possible to have a path length of 20 meters. So you just have a little chamber and you bounce the light back and forward many, many times, and then the light comes out. They normally don't have the light coming back out exactly where it comes in. It'll be sent to a different spot, so you can have a
but
detector.
you can do the calculations for that and get it exactly where you want it. So.
And those normally involve either some kind of cylindrical container where you're either bouncing off the curved walls, or it's a cylinder with a slightly warped parabolic mirror at each side, and you bounce it back and forward until it exits. And these things you can calculate almost perfectly. The retro reflector, I'm going to have to look into this a bit more. Maybe that can be something.
This would be a good video. This would be
actually, I'm thinking about it. It would be. But here's the thing: when you actually fire the laser from the ground at the moon, people might be thinking it's just something.
You have to aim for the retro reflector. No,
and if you don't hit it perfectly, because it's actually small, it's only I believe it's only something in the order of like this big. Like you could hold it.
It's less than a meter by a meter.
Yeah, it's not a big object.
It's about. I mean, Americans made it. It's about 2 foot by a little over 1.5 feet.
Yeah, although NASA actually generally works in SI.
I know, but they still made it like that so they could.
Yeah, but the engineers don't always work for them. Or who work for them don't always do that, as we know with the Mars Climate Orbiter and the payload it had, and smacking that into the surface of Mars, which if people want to ask me about that one, feel free to, although you might be doing it in the comments. But yeah, that's why we should probably always work in the same units, or at least when you're writing code to convert units, make sure that code actually works. I've done enough coding to know that debugging is what you spend half your time doing. So,
especially if several decimal places actually matter, make sure it's right.
Yeah, but this time they're off by like a factor of, I think, 2 or 3.
It
wasn't
3,
just a few decimal places. It was they're off by more than 200 kilometers.
Yeah, it was immense amounts. But
it wasn't just
the distance, it was the speed. Because they did all the speed calculations wrong too. So it was actually coming in at about 2.5 times faster than what it should have. So there was no way, even if it landed in the right spot, it wasn't going to survive.
And the other thing, okay, so, hey Perps, one of the things they did, just for anyone who's not familiar, the Mars Climate Orbiter was meant to be a satellite that was going to orbit Mars, and it did actually have a payload. I think it was a rover as well, wasn't it? Or was it? It did have a ground payload. It had a vehicle, and it also had an orbiter and the satellite was meant to go around, just keep an eye on, obviously.
I know the satellite worked. Yeah, because it was Mars Climate Orbiter.
Yeah, though, what happened is the engineers who built the actual package, including the orbiter, worked in imperial units because, well, it's a US engineering firm, whereas NASA, being a scientific firm, works in standard units because, of course, they do. They're a scientific firm. That's just the global standard. You can't be a science firm and then publish in anything that isn't, because it just means that everything's at least consistent. And there are myths out there where they say that, they just, forgot that. But no, they did know this, Neither side is that stupid that they didn't know they were working in different units. What happened is they had to write a code that converted all of the equipment, like the onboard, velocity meters, altitude meters, all the detectors on board had their units were in Imperials that had to be converted to SI units for NASA's basically software and hardware control back on Earth. And also to fit with their code and their launch and, I guess, orbit data as well. But they got the conversion in the code wrong. So it was converting the wrong units. And I think, as Jen mentioned, it wasn't just one unit. They got a few things wrong. And so when it starts orbiting Mars, the readings that NASA got back were saying that it's going too fast. And when you're trying to get something into orbit, there is a very particular velocity that you need to travel to maintain that orbit. That particular, and that will vary for different bodies in the middle. So if you go between different planets or between the sun and the Earth, it's all going to change. And also the distance from them is also going to affect what that velocity is. And this is ignoring air resistance, which is very minimal around Mars anyway. It's not non-existent, but it's minimal enough that if you're far away from it, it's not the problem that, say, the ISS here has, where it actually drops in height. And so every time you send a rocket to it, they actually have to push it back up a little bit because otherwise it would have already crashed into Earth, because there is a tiny, tiny bit of air resistance up there, 400 kilometers away, but still. But when it was reading it was going too fast, that their instinct was, okay, the only way for it to keep up this velocity and stay in orbit is to bring it down. So that was what they did. They're like, okay, it's going too fast. It's going to just basically keep going and it's going to go out of Mars' orbit. What they didn't realize is that instead of being about 200 kilometers above the surface, it was only 50. So when they tried lowering it, they not only had a wrong velocity readings anyway, but they also had the wrong height, and the thing just basically nosedived straight into Mars.
It was the wrong everything. Wrong height, wrong location, wrong speed. It was like comedy of errors. A multi-billion-dollar comedy of errors, but a comedy of errors nonetheless.
Also, hello, Titan.
Hi, Titan.
Giant butthole's with us now. And as Titan once said, that's actually how we can tell where I first met Titan.
It's amazing how we got to units of measurements and things on Mars from retroreflectors on the moon.
I mean, it's all still related to astronomy. Oh,
it is.
Hey, Time Show.
Hey, Time Show. And Gary.
Yes. I think purple is also right. I don't think NASA would have found it funny.
They
Yeah.
probably do now, years later, but at the time, no.
No, because we were talking several $100 million worth of equipment. And also keep in mind, you can only launch to Mars every 1.5 years, and it takes about 1.5 years to get there. Because the orbits have to align so that it's actually efficient to get there. Otherwise, you're expending far more energy.
We can do it quicker, but there's a lot more. You need a lot heavier lift rocket to do it.
Yeah, and
which is
it's just
why we haven't.
The cost just goes up almost exponentially.
Yeah.
So to actually launch to Mars, unless it was like a rescue mission of people, which obviously at the moment it's not something we need to worry about. Yeah, you have a very small window. And not only that, but the equipment and the rockets are just a tiny, tiny bit costly. I wonder what inflation has done to rocketry.
Ooh. We haven't had a lot of launches in the last couple of years.
My research group in the past has launched CubeSats, although most people have ties to groups that have done that, but I'm not going to mention which ones or what they were for because, well, that means people can narrow down which one it is. But yeah, I've basically met people who have satellites in orbit. Although I've also met people whose satellites stopped and never actually sent a signal. So they're somewhere in orbit, but they're lost.
Well, the failure rate...
Which is actually really, really common because
that's why CubeSats are so good, because the failure rate for satellites is reasonably high. I mean, you're talking about at least 1/8 of satellites don't work initially. So the really big ones, often they try to launch them so that they can go back and fix them if they need to, or else it's just you got to launch another one, and it's really expensive. So CubeSats are great because they're quite cheap because you launch them in groups and stuff like that. So, and they're cheap to build in the first place, so you can save costs, but you still end up with the same value, right?
It looks like we're not the only ones who've had ties with CubeSats. Yeah. But yeah, they're generally in the order of about 1 kilo, and some of them are as small as like 10 centimeter cubes. So they're tiny little thing. Yeah. I mean, first rule of technology, is it powered on? And then if not, turn it off, turn it back on. So yeah, maybe someone forgot that.
And then you have weird things in the programming for stuff that doesn't always make sense. I have got a great example from my day today. The hospital bed that I have in here is hospital beds are amazing things. The way they can lift and they lock and they do all the functions so that the nurses don't have to do a lot of hard work if they're trying to shift patients around and stuff like that. This particular model of the hospital bed has a flaw in its programming. And that is if it's brought all the way up to its full height and then locked in position so that the buttons don't work, and so you can't accidentally thing it, you cannot use the unlock button to unlock the bed anymore. And it keeps settings if you unplug it, unless, of course, you wait for the battery to go flat. So what you actually have to do is there's another button on it that never locks, and that's to do with emergency dropping of the bed. So if somebody's in cardiac arrest or something like that, you have to use that button, drop the bed all the way, and then unlock it. But nowhere in the manual for the bed does it tell you to do that, because it's a fault in the software.
Yeah, that seems that someone has put, like, it's a bunch of like if statements, and if the bed is locked,
somewhere in that
someone's
bed,
got them round the wrong way, and it's I've done enough programming to know that you write all these functions, you're like, okay, this seems logical, and then the code ends up in this path you didn't expect, like trying to navigate some maze, and you hit this dead end.
Trying everything to figure out what it was. In the end, I had to spend 20 minutes searching the net to find the fault, because it was documented, but not in the manuals and not on the website. So I had to go hunting to find the solution for it. And it's a simple solution, but...
yeah, I wonder how long of trial and error it took to figure that out. Although I guess you just start hitting every button if you couldn't move it, and eventually one of them would work. So, but yeah, that's why... Yeah. If I write code, and I'm not a programmer, but I do need to do it to basically analyze my results, control my equipment, and to basically make nice plots for for my PhD. Yeah, most of the time I just end up putting display or print statements everywhere. So basically the code spits back what it's doing. And so I'll have it that if it ends up in part of the code, it shouldn't be. It would just print something's gone wrong or some error message. Sometimes I like getting creative, but I have to be careful in case someone else reads the code about what I'm allowed to do. Oh, look, we've got I have another one.
Yeah, somebody is looking.
Yes, no, this is a Q&A session. We just had a quiet start, so Jen and I were basically
I know it's not a question time and show, but are you talking about pacemakers? But I'm getting one. So I actually know a fair bit about pacemakers now. And they can actually turn them off. All the pacemakers, modern pacemakers, actually have an external radio interface that the doctors can use to control them and reprogram them and things like that, depending on what's needed for the patient. So, so an example of that is like if you have a pacemaker and then you have to go and have an MRI. Most modern pacemakers are designed so as long as you're using a lower powered MRI, it won't rip the pacemaker out of your chest. But they have to turn the pacemaker off to do that. So they will put the person on monitoring, turn the pacemaker off, put them in the MRI and do all the scanning, and then turn the pacemaker back on once it's all over. So you can, depending on the patient with the pacemaker. So like for me, I'm bradycardic, so my pulse rate drops down really low, all on its own and does stupid things. I've got a couple of other arrhythmias, but in general, the pacemaker is only helping keeping my pulse rate normal. I don't have to worry about even though my heart does occasionally stop, they're called pauses, and the longest one I've had was nearly 5 seconds. But somebody with bradycardia, if the sinus node stops beating the heart, the other parts of the heart will take over and make it pump. There's an inbuilt redundancy in our hearts, which means that if the sinus node isn't working, the other part of the heart takes over and goes, all right, we're going to pump anyway. But they're not designed. They haven't evolved to have a regular heartbeat, so your heartbeat goes irregular when that happens. So the idea of the pacemaker is to make sure that if the sinus node's not working properly, the pacemaker takes over rather than letting the rest of the heart take over, so you can have a steady, normal heart rate, which is kind of cool. But yeah, they generally speaking, depending on the reason for the pacemaker, they can actually be turned off. They also have little warning alarms in them. So that if the pacemaker suddenly stops working, your chest will beep at you, which is kind of cool too.
I mean, I think you'd kind of want to know if anything was going wrong in that one.
Oh hell yeah! Like I mean, I'd probably figure it out with mine because I know what I feel like when my pulse isn't working properly. But yeah, you'd like to have a heads up that this is just suddenly happening because, you know, you can go back to doing an awful lot of stuff when you get a pacemaker, and some of those things you're actually not capable of before. So all of a sudden it stops working and you might just collapse. So yeah,
well, hopefully that doesn't happen. But anyway, although it's somewhat connected to medicine, I think Gigi has a few questions, and I think we're going to get into a bit of pseudoscience here. So what's your opinion on colloidal silver, cupping, and urine therapy? I think it's pseudoscience.
Suicide?
Yeah, it is. No, well, in some cases it gets quite dangerous. I'll try and keep this a bit lighter. So when it comes to, I'll address the first one, the colloidal silver. When it comes to your body, I guess the biochemistry is incredibly complex. There is no one thing that's going to help you in all fields. You have to treat things on a case-by-case basis. And yes, you can get multiple failures when something goes wrong if you're looking at, I guess, chemicals being absent. Oh, hi, Triple D. And why am I here? We'll get to your question in a bit. I don't even know why I'm here sometimes. And so when it comes to pseudoscience, one of the quick ways to tell when it comes to these, like, oh, here's a treat, like, I mean, bleach is another good one, the sort of bleach therapy as well, and all those, the turpentine. I've heard people who think that's good for you. No. And it's also going to answer the last one too. Anyone who tries to sell anything as a cure-all is also wasting their time. Anyone who tells you that it's for detox can I just say that if your body is having trouble detoxing, something is probably wrong with your liver, and you don't need a supplement. You need a doctor, and most likely you need the ER department or ICU in a hospital.
And you'll be yellow.
Sorry?
And you'll be yellow.
Yeah.
If your body's not detoxing, even if your liver's not failing, you will still start to get jaundiced if your body's not detoxing. So
yes. It's how you can go yellow from eating snails, because you can get a disease that gives you that, and then you end up going yellow. I remember that as a weird piece of trivia. But the and also silver itself, so the chemicals that are generally essential for your body's function are actually very close, or at least if we're talking about trace metals, things like iron, magnesium, etc., calcium, sodium. They're all the ones that are actually quite common in seawater, because that's where life originally evolved. So the very basic biochemistry comes from that. I remember that from my senior metals in medicine lectures that you talk when you want to talk about which metals are generally required for human function. It's actually somewhat similar to salt water. Not identical. There are differences, and obviously, but so silver's not one of them. So generally, you don't want silver in your body. It's fairly inert. But I mean, you can make drugs out of gold, and you can make them out of silver as well. Though I've heard only a few cases of gold. There's a nice one that does it for arthritis. I think there's ones that do it, but it's been a little while since I've been
it. Because there is a drug that does contain gold that can be used for arthritis, but there is also a thing in South America where they've just been using gold dust as a treatment for arthritis. And if you're ingesting gold dust, you are poisoning yourself.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
We don't ingest gold dust.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where a chemical that contains gold is not the same as gold.
Yes. And that's a big one. Mercury is a really, really good example here. You have to look at exactly what chemical someone like you're taking, and you can't just look at it and go, oh, it's got mercury, it's going to kill you. Not always the case. Metal mercury will actually do very little to you. I've seen x-rays where people have injected themselves, I think accidentally most of the time, with metal mercury, and then come back years later and you can still see it. I remember one someone's hand, you can actually see it in the x-ray. It's not going to go anywhere. Wow. However, if you start attaching organic components to that mercury, it now becomes fat soluble. And when you get heavy metals with fat soluble components on them, that's when they tend to get really, really dangerous. Tetraethyl lead, as they used to put in the leaded petrol, some of the organic lead parts for lead paint again, and mercury, methyl or ethyl mercury, like a drop or two on your skin of some of those will be fatal within a month or two, which is really fast for heavy metals. So, and when you get those heavy metals in the environment, that's normally what happens. Bacteria actually get to them and then convert them into these organic versions that can then get inside and make it really toxic. And that's when they can get into your blood and into your brain, etc. And so, you want to always look at the exact chemical. And so, but generally, silver's not a good one. As for urine therapy, that one's easy. The reason it's urine is because it's the stuff your body's already filtered it out. Yeah. And if your kidneys are not working properly, then you need a hospital. You don't need any therapy, although even then you wouldn't want to drink what's coming out. But it's the waste product. So drinking waste is never going to hurt. And here's one. Urine is not sterile. That's another one too.
Definitely not.
It can.
So don't let anyone pee on you if you get bitten.
I think that's also a myth.
It is. It's complete myth.
Yeah, because some people talked about like the chemicals in it and the basicity being able to help with those, but it doesn't. In fact, it's actually known to unlock more of the, like, particularly because you're thinking in the process of things like jellyfish bites or sea urchins.
Plus, you could give somebody an infection. So no.
Yes, and on top of what you've probably already got stung with, that's not great, or bitten by. And generally speaking, it just actually makes the whatever toxin you've just been injected with even worse. So, in that case, if it's been injected, it's a venom. But so don't. Cupping, I think the idea behind that is that you basically cause a bit of inflammation around where the cup was. You basically heat the air, and then as it cools, it creates a bit of a vacuum and makes it swell up. And the idea is that it increases blood flow to those areas. But again, yeah, that's not actually going to help. There's very few medical cases where encouraging blood flow to an area in anything like that would be useful. And generally it actually has to do with bones. So you actually need surgery to get there. In terms of blood flow around your body, particularly to areas of your skin, yeah, cupping isn't going to help. And in fact, because of what you're actually doing, it just going to likely do damage. I know there's a lot of athletes who get into that. Well, at least a few years ago.
I can't believe the chat's talking about people peeing on their own feet.
Yeah, I don't know how I would actually know anything. Although I do actually have
too, but I like Davros's reason.
Yeah, I do actually have one case in history where it was actually useful. In World War One, I'm just going to hide current comment because I think we all know what we're talking about. In World War One, there was I believe he was a captain, a British captain, and his unit is in the trenches. This is a couple of years into the war, and it's stalemate in the trenches, and both sides have started to get a bit desperate in terms of how they break this. The British one was just mass artillery and just pummel the enemy until you basically walk over the craters, and that turned out not to work until they made the artillery more effective. You can look at the Battle of the Somme. But this captain one day I'm assuming got reports from his soldiers first, but looks out over the trench and sees a yellow cloud pouring out from over the German lines and drifting his way. Do you know this story, Jed?
No, I don't.
Okay. Do you know what you would do in that case? Yellow tinted cloud, and it's heading towards your trenches. Now, at this point,
you'd
it
probably
was just released
be
with
assuming
valves.
it was mustard gas.
Not yet, actually.
Like
this is the first ever chemical attack in World War One.
It is. Well, you wouldn't assume that then, but you would assume it wasn't normal.
Yeah. However,
they did have gas masks fairly early on in the.
Yes, but gas masks were a response to this. So at this point, no one has a gas mask. No one is expecting it. But fortunately, one of the officers, and I believe it was a captain, which is why I mentioned captain earlier, actually was a pharmacist. So he had some chemistry knowledge, and he recognized that yellow tinted cloud as chlorine gas.
Yeah.
And so he ordered all of his soldiers to urinate on rags and cover their faces. Now, there's a tough one. You're in trench. You have no idea what's happened, and your captain has just told you to do that. You've never seen this before, and do you trust him? The reason he did it is that the urea actually reacts with the chlorine and basically stops it getting through the rag.
Well,
and
most of it.
Because of his fast thinking, he did end up saving his unit, or at least a lot more of his unit than it would have been. The overall attack was actually very successful. It did drive the British back out of the trench because they weren't ready for it. No one had gas masks. No one had preparation. It was just that one unit. But yeah, still not the best way to do it. So they did. So yeah, but unfortunately the Germans didn't have the reserves to exploit the gap. And so when the wind changed and it basically blew the chlorine away, the British came back into the trenches. And that was the start of a horrible string of gas attacks on each other. And from there, you very quickly got gas masks. But the more famous ones of World War One, the big goggle eyes with some kind of respirator or the tube going to on, those generally ended up with asbestos in them. So yeah, it wasn't pleasant no matter which way you went, although that's a bit of a turn. Sorry, I'm a bit of a hit.
To be fair, they didn't realize what the long-term effects of asbestos was when they started using asbestos.
It wasn't well known, and as long as the asbestos wasn't powdered, you'd be fine. But if you're in a war zone, I can't imagine the filters would stay horribly intact. So I think you'd probably,
You probably live longer than the mustard gas would have let you live, though. You might die eventually of lung cancer, but you.
Well, actually, no. Mustard is actually a good way to treat cancer. The only thing is it's so toxic that it'll kill the cancer, but it'll kill you in the process.
Well.
But there was a lot of work gone into using mustards, chemical mustards, as cancer treatments, because shortly after World War I, there was an accidental release of mustard gas into a hospital, and the cancer patients felt better once they recovered from the initial
devastated lungs
gas attack. But yeah, I'm actually planning to do, when I actually have the time for it. My PhD is getting super busy because I am getting towards the end of it. So yes, Davros, I saw your earlier comment. Yes, I want to be a doctor by now, but PhD is not that fast, unfortunately. And I did start this channel fairly early into it. So yeah, but I'm hoping within the next year. But mustards were not that friendly, and I can, at least with them, I know how they work. But it turns out they were just too toxic for cancer treatment. They killed you just as much as they killed the cancer. But I actually,
to be fair, most cancer treatments are like that anyway.
Well, that's why chemo has such strong side effects, is because yes, it gets the cancer more than you, but it still will get you. So we'll see what happens in the future. But a lot of current drug processes or developments are to basically try and take cisplatin from chemo, which is the one that has the horrible side effects, and actually make it more targeted. So it basically, instead of trying to kill everything, it's a more precision strike, I guess, for an analogy. Also, I did notice Gigi is mentioning that the Germans had coal masks, because activated charcoal makes a great filter, and most gas masks now utilize that. And again, whether they contained asbestos or whether they had the filter completely made out of it are not the same question. I would have to look into that. But I am planning to do a video on whether the science around chemical weapons helped make World War I so deadly, because to that current date, it was the most devastating human conflict in history. The only other one the only other two that come close is World War II. And I think I've mentioned the other one. You want to have a guess, Jen? At least if you're going by percentage.
But I was sidetracked by somebody coming in the room.
Oh, okay. So if you're going by percentage, World War I and II take out a huge portion of the human population, but they're not the number one. By World War II, by almost an order of magnitude. If you just go, well, I mean, it's a bit harder because the numbers are rough, but.
So you want to know what war took out the most number of people?
As a percentage.
Oh, it was pre both of them, wasn't it? So.
Well, pre both of them.
Was it Crimean?
No, not the Crimean War.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily don't look for the name war in it. It was basically a very long global fight. Purple, good guess. That's the US's highest casualty war. Is the US was fighting on US soil against the US, but globally it was a relatively small affair in terms of numbers, although it is still really big for the American continent. I think it's still the biggest war in the American continent. I know it's America's biggest war by casualties. It was the Mongol invasions. They reckon that it could have taken up about 17% of the world's population, because the Mongols just wiped almost every city they came across as a fear tactic. But again, those numbers are more rough. But yeah, it's meant to be. But if you look by number of casualties, the top 20 of the world's biggest, I guess, conflicts by just pure numbers of those who unfortunately perished. World War I and II are basically the only two that appear in Europe.
Yeah.
Everything else is in Asia, generally in China, because there was just so much of the world's population around there. And
they were pretty brutal to each other as well. So.
At times, but you could say that about almost anywhere. But yeah, you had a very population, population density, so you could do that. And yeah, there was one person who believed, I think he was the brother of Christ in China, and started a civil war that lasted for years, and that was one of the biggest fights on that continent too. And also remember World War II, the second biggest front by numbers was the Sino-Japanese one.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. That's more history than science. But
yeah, we've done science.
I like my history, and I actually do want to make
other questions,
small videos that kind of do a bit of both. But
so what was the next question? Because we sort of answered the question, then we sidetracked, and maybe we should answer a question.
It was to do with pseudoscience, and it was to do with those different ones, or the different some of the different pseudosciences. Gigi's got a good point. The Mongols had rocket launchers. Yeah, the actual advances in warfare during the Mongol invasions was actually quite impressive, because they conquered pretty much most of the known world at the time. And it was also one of the first wars where gunpowder actually featured to any significant extent. And it's the first time you see basically hand grenades, rockets, and primitive, probably would have been referred to probably more accurately as hand cannons, but essentially early firearms. It wasn't the first time they ever appeared, but it was the first time they started to actually see use in any decent number, at least that I'm aware of. And then Europe kind of took the idea of gunpowder, went further. But the biggest scientific advance that allowed gunpowder weapons like cannons, because remember, artillery was always a bigger thing than muskets and eventually rifles. Go look at Napoleon. He loved his artillery.
Well, muskets took too long to reload and too vulnerable, because the person holding it was going to be dead if they couldn't.
Oh, their effective range was 91 meters, and they had an accurate range of about 2 centimeters.
To be honest, a lot of the bowmen were actually still more accurate in the early days of the muskets.
I think so. I remember reading a statistic where I think it was like, was it every 10,000 bullets to be manufactured led to one death in the Napoleonic Wars? Most bullets didn't. But then again, it's hard to tell, because a lot of bullets would go missing from other reasons.
Muskets came down to the same sort of thing as why crossbows got popular over longbows. Longbows have a longer range and are more accurate if you know how to use them. But
the range was actually shorter for a longbow, but you could fire them much faster. And by the time someone's reloaded,
if you were trained,
you're in range.
If you were trained, But the crossbows became common because you didn't really have to train someone to use a crossbow. It wasn't the same level of training. 2 hours of training to use a crossbow. So crossbows became more common. And of course, a musket, even easier to train somebody to use it and fire it and everything. So muskets took over. It wasn't because to begin with they were any more efficient. They became more efficient as the technology improved. But in the beginning, they weren't more efficient. It was just way easier to teach people to use them.
Yeah. Although they did
a lot more damage if you hit someone.
One of the things that actually was the reason cannons and muskets, guns, really took a while to take hold in Europe is they couldn't actually make the metal to a high enough quality to ensure that whatever weapon you had didn't actually rupture and blow up in your face. It was really common to have those sorts of misfires. I think one of the first units, I remember my history teacher at school telling me, the Spanish, they had units of about 1,500 men armed with what was essentially a metal tube, and you just put a bit of gunpowder and a bullet at one end, and then they would carrying this long wick around them that was slowly burning down, and they'd stick it in. And they suffered about a third of their number as casualties from misfires during any conflict, and about 15% of them would die. So it was just they couldn't do it safely. But then when they got better at it, you had better better ones, then it started to take off. But it was basically manufacturing. And if you look at kind of Europe's start towards what we think of as like big production lines and particularly metal forging, it actually had to generally do with cannon making. That was one of the things Henry VIII was actually less famous for, but probably had more of an impact than anything else he did.
Yeah,
because that was what gave rise to what we consider the big, powerful British Navy, and we know.
But this is why artillery was more popular, because you could overcome the problem of our metallurgy and our construction things by just making the walls of it thicker. So a cannon was unlikely to explode when you set it off, but a musket would.
But they also needed to eventually build the forges that could do that. Even still, like, this is one thing that I've never actually seen done well in movies, is when you have movies about sort of King Henry V. So, Henry V? Yeah, when he and Agincourt, the siege beforehand, I've seen people show trebuchets, but they had cannons. I mean, the French did actually smash them with axes in a raid where they managed to actually damage a bunch of the cannons. So you basically rupture them a little bit, and then if you fire it, they peel like a banana. But it was we've got Diesel here as well. Hello.
Hi, Diesel.
Also, I did notice. Yeah, this is also a really good point. A lot of those, as well as fireworks and things, were not very effective. But to an army that was not familiar with those sorts of things, they're brilliant because they're a scare thing. And a lot of work over history has gone into how do you scare them. And fireworks, one of the reasons they were so effective, even though they hardly hit or did any damage, was if you had an enemy that had cavalry, the horses would get so spooked. Eventually, armies learned how to train horses. But if you look at, say, by the Napoleonic era, even, well, actually, late medieval, they started to figure their way around it. They had to specifically train animals, particularly horses, how to deal with that noise. And I know in some of the early fights that the British got into where they had camel divisions, they didn't realize that they don't respond in the same way as horses. Camels' approach to loud noises or scary situations is to sit down. So I remember, I think it was World War I, but I could be wrong, where one of their units tried to charge the enemy and the camels got scared and sat down. And so they ended up in the middle of open ground and they couldn't move. So they had to learn how to train them around that. Like, I wouldn't want to be soldiers in the middle of that one. But Purple's got a good point. Yeah, up to about 1800. And that's, as I said, that was when you start to see the more modern technology coming in for forging.
A bit of metallurgy was a big one, yeah.
Yeah, chemistry, science. See, it is relevant. Chemistry. There is so Diesel thinks cannons were created by atheists. Well, as I said, King Henry VIII was the one who revolutionized iron cannons in Europe. So, and we all know what he's also famous for, what he's more famous for. But yeah, by the time you get to like World War I and II, the weapons people were coming up with were just ridiculous. Some of the German guns they had.
You mean creating a new religion just so he could have more divorces?
A lot of that also was actually not a political. Was less a political decision, more a financial one. That he also wanted to do it so that the church couldn't take money or land. He was in control of it. And the divorce is like the public reason.
Oh no, he's
given, but it wasn't actually the main reason.
The Catholic Church had too much say in what was going on in England, and it was
and he didn't like it. And eventually, he had enough power to tell them, "No, if you don't like it, that's what he did."
Sorry, you're channel
it wasn't anything to do with anything philosophical. It was purely political and financial. And at the time, England was at war with most of Europe on a fairly regular basis, particularly the French and the Spanish. So although the British Empire was built stealing all of the gold from the Spanish, who were stealing it from Central and South America.
They all stole from each other.
Yes, but the British did it better because they had a better navy that was better suited to the Atlantic. So again, they had a different approach with their cannons. because they could produce more cannons cheaper than other people, at least early on, they put more of them on their ships, and their ships were faster and would keep their distance and shoot at the enemy more. Whereas the Spanish and French had an approach of, no, it's basically a floating castle. Get up near your enemy and then have a land battle. So the British were like, we're just not going to let you close.
Yeah,
we're just sending
from a distance,
cannonballs from you at a distance. But anyway, this is, oh, by the way, this is still a science Q&A. So if you have science questions, ask them.
We've just got heavily sidetracked. That's the problem.
I mean, it still has to do with chemistry, really.
The chemistry of metallurgy is fascinating. And it's more your thing than mine, but it's...
Yeah, and if you look at history, the metals that humans basically started to forge first are the least reactive, and it's a general trend. As technology gets more advanced, you head towards using more and more reactive metals. The really good example is gold is one of the first, metals that you see traded or used in any quantity, followed by things like copper, and then, I guess you can make, I say, bronze and brass, but you need tin and other things for it. But again, they're less reactive than iron, and then after that, so it's why we go through, Bronze Age before the Iron Age. And eventually you get to aluminium in kind of the modern era, but aluminium is just so reactive, you have to pump an insane amount of energy to purify it. But most people are actually fairly familiar with aluminium, but it's a good one. Also, I know Gigi did ask about rail. I'm not actually very familiar with it, so I'm not sure I can be the first unless you.
Me either.
So unfortunately, sorry, can't be too helpful here. Sorry about that one, but I'm gonna have to pull the. I don't know.
The chromosome one. I wish Mira was here. But I don't know if that's true or not. If there was a scientist who thought they saw 24 chromosomes and then it stayed in the
I'm not either, but I actually think I may have heard something on this. I'm just not very familiar with it. But I think what someone was talking about is it was the 48 chromosomes, but people were talking about pairs. And I think they got confused and it was half. So they thought it was actually half of the number. That does sound a bit more familiar, but I can't give too much detail. But yeah, there are cases like that. But often when people say it stays in the literature, that doesn't mean people didn't correct it. It just may have taken that long before the correction became mainstream. So... yeah.
In a lot of these cases, it's a case of people go back to old textbooks and then think that whatever they read in the old textbook is still what is current science now, and you cannot treat science like that. Science changes all the time. It's not one book that was published hundreds of years ago and we follow that, because science learns and adapts and moves with the times. We have to take on board new evidence, and when we have new evidence, we write new papers, we write new science books are updated, what people are taught is updated. So yeah, and it's quite easy for people to think that something that was valid 30 years ago is still valid now when it may not be.
Here's a really good one that's like that, and it's somewhat related to Gigi's one because it's still about human physiology. It's that one about you have more bacterial cells in you than you cells. That's not true. The number is roughly, and it's going to depend hugely person to person, but roughly, very roughly on average, it's about 54 trillion of U cells to about 52 bacterial cells. So no, it's not really the case. And it will also depend human to human. You take a bunch of antibiotics that basically clean out a fair few of them from your digestive tract, and that number is going to change dramatically. But it is a bit of a myth. It's someone that's because you hear like even 3 or 4 times as many bacterial cells as U cells, and that's never really the case. But yeah, that's the
unless
one.
Maybe if you have a bacterial infection.
Well, it depends, because those infections it's not actually a huge number of bacteria, because you have a lot of bacteria. It's the ones that you have are producing something that's toxic. So you don't need a huge amount of them compared to your regular bacteria. You just need enough of them to produce some toxin that's going to send you a little crazy. We get to that one. Also, by the way, just to address this one, I did say in the description you can ask me any question. I don't do philosophy or politics on this channel though, so I will generally ignore those just because that's not what I do here. I don't have a background really in either of those, unless it's history, but that's like I don't generally won't talk about much after 1945. But yeah, I did say I'll answer them, but no promises that people will like my answer, unfortunately. And that answer will often be, like it has been, I don't know, but that's curious.
But that's 24 pairs,
answer.
which would be 48 instead of 46 chromosomes. But it's quite probable that he did think that when he was doing the study. He miscount. The slides he had were erroneous. He's not doing enough backups. But regardless, it's the fact that you publish a paper and then people refer back to that paper without looking at any new studies that have been done. I mean, a great example I see of this is when you get Turkey people talking about biology, and especially with the one where they go that every single cell in your body has chromosomes, which has XY chromosomes, which is not true in anyone, because some of the cells in our body don't carry that. But most do, but some don't. And any of the cells that aren't actually you, like the bacterial cells that are in you, don't carry that. But it's still technically part of you. So they're in your body. So yeah, it's one of those crazy things where people read a textbook from 20 or 30 years ago and go, yeah, this is how it is, without looking at the modern science, and because the science changes. And it's good that it does. I think that's the best part about science.
It's also more common in like science media rather than like formal journal publications, because people then just read the previous ones for what they think is a basic stat without referring back to it. And
you get that's that all where you get
the previous example I was talking about is common, and maybe that's what Gigi's getting here. I'm just going to kind of paraphrase these, but it looks like, he's showing a quote where it basically says that this guy kept saying it was 24, despite that, there are photos showing 23 pairs. Incorrectly declared the number to be 24. Yeah, you do get people who get very dogmatic, where they just will not change their opinion even when shown with facts. And unfortunately, there's a number of psychological, I guess, barriers that you have to overcome. Humans don't like being wrong, and one of the things that it's probably one of the longest mindsets to get into when you try becoming a scientist or engineer or any related field is to embrace being corrected. Although I have definitely met many very experienced academics who still do not like being corrected. But most of the people I work with now, if I correct them, they won't get wrong at me for the correction. They won't get angry at me for correction. They'll get angry at me if I can't back up me telling them they're wrong.
Which I think is actually fair.
That's how it should be.
If you're going to tell somebody they're wrong, you should have
a reason for it.
You should have evidence for that.
The only time where you don't need a reason is when your rebuttal is, how do you know that? And they don't have an answer.
Yeah.
But I don't come across that.
If your rebuttal is, you need to cite that to me, then they don't need you to have a citation back to them. You're requesting their citation. They've made a claim. They need to back it up. But it's,
And actually, I can also link it to this question here. I'm hoping within the next year or so. I do want to submit towards the end of this year, but it might have to be early next year. We'll see. But PhDs are long because it is so hard to learn how to do science. And with COVID also that causes some delays. But I'm not going to be much longer than what you would expect. But PhDs are long. They just are. It takes a long time to be a scientist. So that's why, particularly other people with science or engineering PhDs, I have so much respect, because it's not easy. It's the reason I can't do more videos for this channel, because the early bit is okay. It's not too stressful, but there's sort of getting into this last stretch. I don't have much free time. I don't. It's a lot of work. And everybody, there's a lot of work to do with it. And as I said, I will make a nice video to explain what my PhD is about, but I'm going to wait till the end. You don't have too much longer to wait. more than halfway through before you all get to hear about that. But I will give the hint that part of it is making methane sing with a laser.
That's a show we all want to see.
You're welcome. I hope to see you back here. I will do more streams. I'll try and make them also regular. A lot going on. I've been very, very busy last couple of months. So yeah, but I do want to make these regular because I enjoy doing them.
To be fair,
I enjoy taking questions.
Stream on for me.
Yeah. Oh, that too. But I mean, I'm enjoying this as much as you are. But yeah. Hopefully you're enjoying it. But yeah, if you have more questions, go for it. If not, Jen and I are going to ramble and we have no idea.
We have no idea where this conversation, any of this conversation.
Here's one I came across that you might like, Jen, and this has to do with my area of science. Over the last couple of weeks, I've had to use floppy disks.
Yes, you sent me pictures.
To do cutting edge science, I've had to use actual floppy disks. And I know what some people might think. I am still old enough, only just, but I am old enough to remember them. I did use them at primary school, but I used them. So yeah, I had to use it because the equipment that we had, one of the detectors is so old. It doesn't have a USB or even a CD reader. It's just got a floppy disk if you want to export the data.
Yeah.
So, but those machines are like 6 figures to replace. So you're not going to do it if you don't want to. The thing I've been trying to figure out, just based on like the ports and the connections on the machine, I will eventually look it up to see if I'm right. Although I want to know if the machine's older than me or not. I have the feeling it's not. I think I am, but only by a few years. I think it was very late 90s is my guess for this.
See, it amazes me. You've got these old machines, and floppy drives are getting harder and harder to get. And even if you get them, often they've already failed because they will fail sitting on the shelf. The magnetic material doesn't last forever. So why aren't they getting Go drives or GoTex or something like that and taking out the floppy drives and putting those in? Because then you could save all your data to an SD card, which you can still get.
I'm not sure.
And the GoTex aren't expensive, and they replace any floppy drive. So it's a sensible upgrade to make to these old machines, because for less than $100, they could technically have these machines updated to take SD cards. And in my mind, it's like, why isn't this happening? It's like, why are you struggling with floppy disks?
I don't know. I'll have to think about that one because it's just like, But maybe it's just effort and people don't see enough money in it. That's generally one.
Yeah, Gigi, they're not hard to get at the moment, but they are now. The last company, I think it was Panasonic, who was still making floppy drives, and it was for things like what Matt's using with his detectors and stuff like that, because they're out there. Stopped making them 2 years ago. So the stock we have now is all that is left. The shelf life of that floppy disks aren't guaranteed to work off the shelf for longer than about 10 years. So within the next 8 years or so, the amount of floppies that are going to be available at all, and you won't get new ones, you'll get maybe new old stock, is going to greatly diminish. Now, you'll get floppy drives that can last for 30 or 40 floppy disks that can last for 30 or 40 years. But yeah, and no one's making the floppy drives themselves anymore. So as these things fail, you need to replace them with new technologies like GoTex. So
also, apparently we missed that.
It was a joke. I missed it.
Oh well.
Okay, sorry, but I
don't know. It's still a good question.
It was a good question. That's why I
and a joke
it.
too. So you got to no. What you do is you ask the question, but you intend the pun.
Yeah.
Always intend your puns. Yeah.
Not necessarily purple. When the thing about shelved floppies, ones that have never been used and ones that you've written on, is when you've written on them with the magnetic head, you're actually allowing the material to actually last a little bit longer. It's why old floppies that have been used have outlived those that have not.
And I believe you can rewrite them too.
Yes, you can.
Yeah, which
So,
will help. But once they do break down, there's not much you can do.
yeah,
But as long as you
you're
keep
at
them
the end of
working.
them at this
But yeah,
phase.
I will make this clear. Not much of our equipment does that, and there are alternatives, but the only one with this particular device, I would actually need to have written a specific program to read and write stuff, which for what I needed it for was not worth it. I've done it very similar programs for other stuff for detectors that are probably nearly as old. Because again, one of the things, science is really expensive because nothing that you use is mass produced. It's all specifically built to purpose, which makes it hideously expensive for what it does. And if you're talking certain fields, I'm in integrated optics, so I do a lot with that. There are a lot of components that are so niche or require just a certain level of precision to where there might only be 10 of these things built at any one time in the world. You're like, yeah, it gets expensive, not because for any other reason other than, yeah, it's rare.
I still have some working Commodore 64 floppy disks from, 40 plus years ago. So they may be working, but there's no guarantee.
Yeah, I'm not actually quite old enough for the Commodore. Well, I'm not.
You probably don't even remember 5 1/4 inch discs.
Not really, no.
Because they would have been 3.5 by the time
or at least by the time I was using them, been old enough to use them. I don't know. When did they make the switch? Do you remember?
By the 90s, everything was 3.5.
Yeah, so I would have. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm not old enough to have probably seen them, and even if I was, I wouldn't have remembered them. But yeah, but the thing is, there are some other really old technologies I've had to go at. One of the ones that people ask is, although I have used a traditional film camera, black and white film camera, not the more modern ones, but the older one. But that was not because I was quite old enough, but because they actually still had a few around.
Did you ever use the Polaroid, the self-developing ones?
Yeah. I do remember the Polaroids, not the new ones.
You pull them out, you give them a shake, and then you peel.
That shaking apparently does nothing because it's
does nothing. It does absolutely nothing.
But everyone's still.
But it's
because it was in the instructions, though. They're making a bit of a comeback. It doesn't matter if you wave them around either. But I still remember pulling one out, waving it around, going, "I know this doesn't work. Why am I waving it around?"
Yeah, it was an instruction that came with it to give them a shake and everything. But
I think it was just to make people not worry, give something.
I think because the habit of people will be to pull them out and then peel it straight away. If you were told to shake it for a while before, it made sure that you did at least wait a while before you pulled the cover.
Yeah, I've actually done proper photograph developing, like in a dark room.
Same.
The black and white film and the projectors. It's not easy.
I've
missed so many times that I've got all the images crooked. You're like, it shouldn't be hard. You just line them up. But yeah,
color is so hard to do. And anyone who thinks you do
done color. I've only ever
anyone who thinks you do color in perfect black, you don't have to. You can do it in a really, really, really low light situation, but it is almost impossible to see what you're doing. Which is why color automatic machines became so prevalent, because
there is actually an easy way to do color with black and white cameras. You put red, green, and blue filters individually, one at a time, and take 3 photos of the same thing. Then you can. Then what you do is you basically blast the different colors under each shade. And then you can actually create a color image from a black and white one. It's one way that is still sometimes used in astronomy, where you can't actually put the color equipment in whatever satellite you need. So you have a black and white one, you just put 3 filters or a number of filters, and you just circulate the filters, and you can get a color image back. It's a composite, but that's all you need. You can do pretty well with it. There's a few people that do it. I've seen, you do occasionally see the Twitter post of this is a black and white photo, it's in color. Like, well, it's a color photo, but it was done using black and white film.
Purple's not wrong. Jenny Morgan is probably the most knowledgeable person I know about photography and cameras.
I think, I don't remember them being too wet. But
it wasn't a huge issue. You really did not have to shake them.
No, because most of the chemicals from what I do know of it. Oh, hello. Bzzz,
Hey, Bree.
Most of those chemicals, are fairly volatile. They'll disappear quite quickly, whether you shake them or not. They'll be gone in 30 seconds, most of the ones, because they're generally fairly volatile organics that you use to develop them. I got to check because it's been ages and it's not something that I like. I was still fairly young when I looked into these. I was not at uni, but yeah, we've done that. But yeah, if anyone has more questions. But yeah,
I'll answer Diesel's one from earlier, but I think Diesel's gone off now. Yes, I'm still in the hospital. If you go back to the very beginning of the video, Matt asked me all about that, and I've actually already explained it. But if anyone has any questions for me about what's going on with me, you can ask them. I will answer again, but I'm not going to throw a big monologue about it again.
Okay, can't see too many new questions, but I'm thinking, oh yeah. Yeah, Perps is talking about 0.5 meter in a diameter. I'm just thinking, I cannot imagine that. But I've seen pictures of them. That was well before my time.
Oh, I've held one.
Hydra.
That's just like
alien to me. I probably
I'm doing one and taking out a set of platters and putting another set in. It's good fun.
Although with current technology, despite all the advances, the fastest way to transfer data from some of the world's biggest telescope arrays, because if you want to look at which physical applications generate the most amount of data, it's astronomy by far. The amount of information.
The pictures of the supermassive black holes, both in our own galaxy and
generally it's not even the pictures. It's radio astronomy is the big one, because you generally have multiple of them going and you're just collecting so much data.
Yeah,
it's so many terabytes of data at any one point that it is faster to load all of the data onto hard drives, have someone hop on an aircraft and fly the hard drives to the location than to transmit it by any even modern fiber optic connections. We are getting to the point that will no longer be the case. And there is,
which is exactly how they did the photos of the supermassive black holes. It was all passing data around with hard drives.
But, Oh, I think Bree's got me. We have a question. What is soil? I actually am not 100% sure, but I am not a biologist, so I don't know. But maybe someone can help. I believe it was. The definition does still have to do with a combination of like dead organics and certain minerals, but I could be very wrong on that one. I'm a physical chemist, I think is the best way to describe where I sit.
And soil would vary depending on where you are.
I do know there is a formal definition of what constitutes soil, but the composition of the soil will, depend wildly where you are and even what time of year and day to day too. It can vary. Yes, if we are to talk to an alien civilization, it's going to take a lot of computing power. Probably not, because then that data would at least be somewhat simple, but finding it could be quite hard. But listening to some of the people involved in the SETI project speak, it's amazing the level of detail they've gone into to try and figure out what would constitute unnatural. And it is amazingly complex. And they're saying if you have enough energy, you could actually basically make your own artificial star system so that anyone looking at basically stars would realize that it's been done artificially. But the amount of energy for that is so insane that for us currently, we're orders of magnitude off having anything close to that amount of energy. Oh, there we go. Hey, Mark.
Hi, Mark.
There we go. The upper layer of earth in which plants grow, a black or dark brown material typically consisting of a mixture of organic remains, clay, and rock particles. Generally, so okay. I was only vaguely correct, but yes, there we go. So see, I do not know everything, although I'd never... And of course,
but I don't think either of us ever claimed that, despite me saying I'm a polymath.
It doesn't mean you know everything. It just means you're a specialist in multiple areas. Like you're well read or fairly
well versed.
But yes, if anyone, I know it's in smaller font, but there's a new feature of StreamYards. You can put titles.
Yeah, I noticed that before, but I didn't bother doing one. But I think I will.
I have enabled them if you want to put one in, but I like that one.
That's not yours either, is it? That one? Isn't that pretty much what Dr. Carl said? Educated beyond his intelligence.
Oh yeah,
yours is
yeah. I've heard it a few times before, but I like that one. But it also gets so one of the things I don't like sometimes about science communication is that you talk about like the scientists and the general public are so they're different people. The only difference between someone who is like a scientist in that context is that they've spent years studying science, and sometimes it's portrayed in a way that makes it as though somehow the scientists are smarter than the average person, which I hate because you're not. I'm not particularly clever because I'm doing physics. I've just spent longer than most people studying physics. That's the only difference. But then again, that's the case for any area of expertise. There are people like, yeah, okay, I am not an expert in so many things, even in physics, because that's not how it goes.
Intelligence doesn't mean make you an expert in anything.
Yeah, and so the whole point is I'm trying to show in a hopefully fairly trivial way that it's more about this is just the stuff I know, and so I'm happy to share what I know. But I'm not trying to pretend that being a scientist makes me any way more clever than anyone else. That's not the case. And anyone can be a scientist or at least be scientific. I just happen to have spent a lot of time doing physics and chemistry.
But that's why I like it when we do videos together, because I'm pretty eclectic in my knowledge of things, but I'm no expert in any of it, except for maybe if you're going to talk computer science or in some areas of math. But outside of that, everything else is just stuff that interests me, and I read a lot. And that's the thing. That's how it works for most of us, I think. We're great at the things that we know, but you step outside of those and it's just the things that interest us and how much we read.
Yeah. Also, we do have another question. So what's the computer pictured behind you? I'm not entirely sure, but I know it's the control system for a nuclear reactor.
Yeah, that's what I would have been.
You can actually see other side because it's mirrored. That tiny blurred font, because I think the pixels won't be easy to read, although maybe if you zoom in, because it is 1080, that says reactor. And then on the other side, the mirror image one is radiation. And I found this under, but it's a sort of a stock photo, so of a nuclear reactor control. And I know it's not a Soviet one because those wouldn't be in English if it was. So it's not Chernobyl. Though I did also use it as a background for when I was doing that, but it was the background and not a photo I was using for education. But yeah, it's the control system for a nuclear reactor, and by the look of it, it's still a very analog system. So it's a bit of an older one. I think that's a question, but I'm not entirely sure. Or creators or elements. I don't actually know what that question's getting at.
Were we created by a god, or was it?
Yeah, I don't.
Yeah, I think that's what they're getting.
Philosophy or theology here. Generally, I let people go. The only thing I really ever say on that is that I've worked with people of all sorts of beliefs. I've worked with people who are very, very religious, and of course, I work with people who are the extreme, the other opposite. And I've met all sorts of people. And the thing is, it has nothing to do whether you're a good scientist. The only thing that determines whether you're a good scientist or not is whether you do good science. That's it.
Yeah.
The only time I think I would have a problem with it is if your beliefs got in the way of doing good science. But then my problem there isn't that. It's the bad science or the pseudoscience that comes from that. So yeah, young Earth creationists are probably
you can believe whatever you want.
Because that anti-science generally leads to other more dangerous things than just not understanding.
Well, that's where you end up with things like anti-vaxxing and
that
sort of.
And again, that actually then you get people in those fields from all whose general beliefs are all sorts of different. And my problem isn't with that; it's to do with the anti-science bits of it, and only the anti-science bits. Although in person, I will basically happily sit down with you and have a chat because I find it fascinating. I won't do it on this channel because, again, I'm not an expert. I don't think I'd be adding anything.
So we've got a stranger in a strange land fan down there.
Yeah, possibly. We'll see what any other comments are. Oh, here we go. Oh, you're close to a nuclear power. Well, Australia only has one, so I can't really say I'm too close. Might be close to some.
Do we actually still have one? Wasn't the test plant shut down recently?
I thought Lucas Heights is still running.
Yeah, no, I thought they decided not to.
I gotta. Okay, I'll have to check.
Yeah.
But my friend that I normally get all the information from, who actually is one of the scientists who often sends samples to them, isn't in Australia at the moment. So I'm a bit out of that one. Yeah, if anyone can tell, yeah, my PhD is getting to the point where it's so busy that I didn't really have a life. So, not that I had a huge one beforehand, but yeah, okay. I'll have to check that because I thought he was going to keep running for a bit, but I knew there were issues about how much longer. Although I think they did at least say that the synchrotron was going to keep going for a while.
Oh, that'd be good.
But that was a couple of years ago, so I have to see if they're still doing it. I hope they do, because I know
it's the only place in Australia to do high particle energy.
Yeah, actually, yeah, and it's huge in science to be able to do those sorts of things because there's so many different things that you can test because each beamline is suited to slightly different wavelengths, so you can perform all sorts of different experiments. Basically, you get electrons moving in circles really, really quickly, and then you fire them through a magnet that makes them wobble, and based on the acceleration of moving up and down, they produce X-rays. And you can build each beamline, so you basically, it's like a path with many exits, like many exit ramps to a circular highway, and the different ramps will have different modulations that can give you different wavelengths. I'm obviously oversimplifying a bit, but it's like 20 plus beamlines from memory. So you've got so many different things you can do with it. And these are the sorts of experiments that can do everything from trying to study Martian materials to see if there's life there, to coming up to studying HIV and developing treatments for it based on your understanding of how the protein's structured, so you can build a chemical that gets in and inhibits how it works, because you can understand how it works if you understand what it looks like. So there's all sorts of still doing that. So yeah, there's all sorts of things like that. But yeah, I really hope they keep Lucas Heights going, or at least if it's not currently working, it gets running again, because I really think we need to keep up, because we need to keep experts in this country who know how to use them. I'm not against using the building reactors that are capable of making nuclear weapons. I don't, particularly in Australia, we have no need for that, particularly given our allies. But I think particularly for research and medical and even power, I think we should keep them going. And it takes a long time to build up expertise, but it does not take nearly as long to get rid of it. And unfortunately, based on recent events in Australia, and by recent I do mean probably last couple of decades, we've basically lost most of our particle physicists. Not plasma, sorry. Although we have lost some of the particle physicists, but we've lost a lot of plasma physicists. And if you want to run a reactor, particularly if you want to look at more, particularly if you want to do fusion, although we don't really do that here anyway, you kind of need that. There's a lot of different areas, but yeah, we're losing a lot of it. But again, I'll try not to go too far down that, because then that gets into politics, and we'll leave that one for another day. There are other people who can do a better job of it than me.
Then we end up with the argumentation about renewables versus nuclear, and it's a hotbed, basically. It's not an argument I particularly want to get into, but my personal opinion is that we need a diversified energy portfolio, which probably should include some nuclear, and we definitely need to get away from fossil fuels.
Also, I'm just going to point out, because some comments in the chat, I'm not going to point anyone out at this point because I don't like banning or blocking. Just try and keep them related to science. If they get a bit off topic, I might start hiding people. As I said, I don't want
to be fair, anyone. Wesley's just asking us about a science fiction author. So
Oh, is it? Okay, I didn't.
Yeah, that's about Philip K.
But I
Dick.
did see. Yeah, there was some comments I think earlier, but maybe because I'm trying to glance at the side. But yeah, okay. All right. I don't really know about that one. I have to look at it. Could be quite cool actually. But yeah, there's a few times science fiction's actually inspired real science.
Well,
It doesn't happen
Arthur
super
C.
often, but it does
Clarke.
happen. I think it's the other way around, unfortunately. That's what's happened. Europe's stolen a bunch of them because there's a lot of because a lot of that sort of research is done particularly in Europe, particularly Central Europe. I think
There's
that's where
oddly a
most of
lot
them
of
are.
Australians working at CERN.
Yeah. The thing is, when you finish a PhD, the next thing you go on to is, if you're staying in academia, is known as a postdoc, because postdoctorate, you've got your doctorate and you move on to the next bit. And it's a global understanding that most people, when you finish your PhD, your first postdoc is not done in the same country. It's almost necessary to advance your career. That necessity's dropped a little bit, and it's an unwritten rule, so it's not like anyone has a formal thing, but employers will generally look for it. Dropped a little since COVID because people have realized it's not always as practical. But yeah, so a lot of the people who I'm doing my PhD with started a bit before me, so a lot of them are finishing up, and because of COVID there wasn't a lot of new ones. So so a lot of them will leave the country, but that's common, that happens. But then again, eventually they come back. But when it comes to a lot of the, say, plasma physicists, that's what happened. A lot of them either left for that or for other reasons and haven't come back, because that's just where it is. But to become an expert in any area of science, from a country point of view, does take a lot of funding. It's not easy. And so I'm a big fan of, you start off as like general science, you fund pretty much everything, and then see what expertise develops out of it, and then basically harbor those. You shouldn't ignore the others, but you can then focus on those. So that way you basically build expertise hubs. And I think that's probably a good way for Australia to go forward if we are to get out of coming out of current issues, because we've been losing science funding, at least relative to inflation, for a long time. Yeah, and I don't
not as badly
always
as in the
consider
US
commercial
though.
funding either, because that generally is more, how do you make process X more efficient for drilling oil or getting gas or something, or very specific industrial components, which can be useful because being more efficient's better. But generally speaking, that's not what most people think of with science research. So yeah, if you're thinking about more fundamental research, but yeah.
I love the flying car argument in the chat at the moment.
I gotta. I'm trying to. Where's the flight? Oh, I'm just sorry. I'm just going through them. I did see this one because there's a question. I don't plan on going to academia when I finish, so for me it's less relevant to actually go overseas. So I'm less likely to go anywhere. But anyway, I'd still be able to have access to the internet, because even if I did, I'd be a scientist. You'd have to. So I probably won't disappear off this. Off the platform, although I might make a new channel. We'll see. That's a question for after I finish writing, because it still takes about, from submitting to actually getting the title of doctor, is about 6 months, just because you have to have everything approved and then get the ceremony, and they give you the piece of paper that says you can use it. So yeah, you guys will get plenty of warning before those questions will need an answer. They're still interesting.
Flying cars. The biggest problem with flying cars isn't the physics, isn't the fuel, isn't the whole, how do we build them and make them work and everything. It's the people. Why do you think so few people have licenses to fly airplanes? It's hard to do that. And you have to heavily regulate that, and you have to make sure people fly in the areas they're told to fly. If you give every Tom, Dick, and Harry a flying car, we are going to have carnage in the skies like we have on highways at the moment, but worse. And we'll have cars falling out of the sky and landing on top of people and houses and homes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's not
if that was
not something we want to go in that direction.
I would say the only solution to that would basically be the equivalent of like public transport or self-driving
That could work,
commercial
and
ones with
self-driving.
where you have maybe one trained person on a vessel that can hold many people. But I
Replacements for
have a feeling
aeroplanes,
that
basically.
we'd be able to come up with more ground-based solutions that are probably just as fast by the time you deal
Yeah,
with
well, a
takeoff,
more
landing,
sensible
moving
thing would be
around.
to have ground-based things. If you want to get mostly to a form of public transport in the future, which would be ideal if most people could just use public transport for everything, what you'd probably end up having is short distance AI driven vehicles, and you don't have people driving vehicles anymore, because that's the problem with AI driven vehicles, is the people that are on the road with them.
Whereas if you have multiple of, if they're all AI, then they can interact. They know what the other one's going to do. It's probably safer. But that's how I think a lot of the early driverless cars, I think it will still need someone behind the wheel.
Yeah,
to be able to
but
take over.
You'll end up with having smaller AI vehicles that take you to bus stations, which may have flying vehicles then. And you could have a person as the bus driver, but mostly driven by AI. And that you can have more, if you do, you can have more sites in more locations, which can carry more passengers around and things like that. So we will probably get there, but I don't think it's ever going to be. It's not going to be like Star Wars or a Blade Runner where everyone has their own flying car.
No, I mean, except law enforcement. That's the only one I'm thinking from Blade Runner. Although everyone in Blade Runner seems to have one. But yeah, I mean, Bree's got a good point. And yeah, think about how hard it is to get a helicopter license. And helicopter's not cheap to run either. But again, it's also, you have to look at supply and demand, how many numbers that people want to make off them. But yeah, think about how hard it is to fly a helicopter. I've tried in simulators and I generally crash it into something. So yeah, you don't want me flying one without extensive training. And I don't imagine most people would want to have a go at it either. So yeah. Yeah, I think that's kind of what I was getting to. Although, as I said, you'd still probably want someone trained on board in case things go wrong, because they can. Isn't that like the plot to so many like sci-fi horror films where you basically have ships that are meant to be automated and you don't actually have a crew and like a conscious crew, and then something goes wrong? And then the crew on board and not
the computer goes
not
crazy.
capable or don't know or have to fight something to actually get control of the ship because it was meant to be all automated and it doesn't work. I know that's not a good argument because, you know, they're sci-fi for a reason. They're a story, but oh well. Now, this is another point, although I guess it depends what propulsion system you're using, how you're going to keep them up. But yeah, I mean, helicopters that are close to the ground, you wouldn't want them flying over a bunch of people. You're going to knock people over. Not great. Although we may have lost Jen. So I'll see if we can get Jen back. Let's just try. No, I think internet problems. Oh, well. I'll keep going for the moment. And we'll see if Jen can come back. Keep an eye on. All right. All right. There you are. Dropped out for a second.
Yes,
that was the one.
4G, what do you expect?
Oh, well. He's still here, though. Oh, we're back.
Yeah, I'm still here. I'm back.
Yes. Although, one of the things that sci-fi gets wrong is just how many different future scenarios scientists in that field have generally actually anticipated. But then again, that would make for a very boring movie. It's like, X has gone wrong. Okay, implement plan Y. We know what that is. But occasionally you get stories that are pretty close to it. One of my favorite ones was during one of the Apollo launches. I can't remember which one, but the Saturn V rocket got struck by lightning and it knocked out a bunch of the processors. And the astronauts on board were getting readings where a particular light on the control panel was flashing. And the people at ground control were not entirely sure, but the light was a warning saying the computer was not completing all of its processes. Basically, it would have a bunch of data to process in any one go, and it couldn't do it all. So there was things that weren't getting controlled. And they nearly aborted the mission, but one person in mission control was familiar enough with the system to figure out what had gone wrong, was able to divert them to an auxiliary system, and then noticed the light was not on permanently, which meant that it was still completing most of its tasks, and then just occasionally small bits of data were getting missed. And he knew enough to know, no, it'll keep flying. Just, you're fine. And they got to the moon.
Mark, in answer to your question, he's actually doing better than me at the moment. I'm in hospital.
Yeah. Oh well. We're trying to distract Jen here too.
Yeah, no, that's all right. People can ask questions.
Come on, Jen. 4G, really? You haven't been upgraded like the rest of us?
Yeah.
I don't know why they all say it's like...
No, they might do when they put the pacemaker in.
I have no idea what the latest...
What the hell has somebody got a nuclear welfare office for?
Yeah, welfare office. Can you explain what that means? I have no idea. Yeah, that's a common one. The modern iPhone has like an order of magnitude more processing power than anything got them to the moon. But remember, the computers designed to get them to the moon were meant to be as simple as possible. It's basically, what is the simplest thing that can do it? And they wrote, the code was written in hardware. They actually had, at least for the early launches, they wrote the code by getting a thread and going through magnetic rings or bypassing them for ones and zeros. So you could not change the code. And the point of that was that meant that nothing could go wrong and corrupt the code whilst the rocket was in launch. You may have briefly lost Jen again. So yeah, that's one thing. But yeah, they could build more complicated computers, though. Yeah, still an iPhone was more powerful than pretty much anything at the time. But the ones specifically used in early space race were, well, even later space race, were designed to be as simple as possible because you don't want to carry any more weight than you need in space. It's not easy. Okay, there we go. We've got a bit more. Yeah, see, the problem with we've lost Jen. Yeah, one of the problems with these, the early ones is that to build a powerful computer was not easy. It was just, modern sort of digital systems just didn't exist. But yeah, these are the sort of questions that Jen's really good at because it's more computer science. And we just lost Jen. Oh, no, you're back. You're back. There we go. Yeah, we're getting all the computer questions. I'm like, I don't know these.
I know, and I
all my time and not my area. So you're gonna have to save me.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic where you say that the base computer at NASA during Apollo had about the power of a first generation Pentium, or when you talk about Commodore 64 being more powerful than the machine in the original things. Yes and no. It depends on what you're wanting to use them for. So a lot of the early processors, like you're dealing with an 8-bit CPU that's in the Commodore 64, 6502, if an early 8-bit processor, pretty efficient for its time. But some of the processing units that they had in NASA in the 60s were actually 24-bit processors. So they could actually process bigger numbers than an 8-bit processor could in one go. So whilst the processing speed of the chip may have been slightly slower, although generally they weren't, most of the ones that NASA were using were around the 2.5 megahertz speed, so actually a little faster than the Commodore 64 was. The biggest problem was data storage, because there was so much data they were dealing with, and the amount of RAM that you could have at the time, they could only process small amounts of data at a time. So whilst the processors themselves were actually just as capable as, say, the 6502 in the Commodore 64, the amount of storage you could have was a lot more limited. They were using like tapes And maybe if you were lucky, you had an early rack hard drive, which NASA would have had, but that was only for final data storage. Everything was coming off tapes. Everything was being processed in smaller amounts of memory because memory was so expensive. So whilst the machines were faster and could process a lot of data, could process those individual data a lot at once, to do big bulk calculations took a lot of time. It's why in some cases it was actually quicker to have people do them, because by the time you're offloading and loading for the faster calculations, it was quicker to have a room full of people called calculators, or computers at the time, because the people were called computers, doing the calculations than it was to have a computer system. And that was the whole thing. NASA's computer system. There's a movie made about the women of color who did all the maths for NASA, and I can't Colorful Figures or something like that it was called. I can't remember exactly, but basically the computer system that NASA first had was capable of doing all these calculations, but the act of programming it, the act of getting all the data in there, by the time you got the data in there, you got the list made, and then you could run the program on the computer to do the calculations. The room full of people was quicker. And that was the whole thing.
Yeah, a computer was originally a person, not a machine.
Yeah, a computer was a person.
Yeah, and again, science advances like most things, and we get faster at doing it, which also leads into some of the other things in the chat about, say, like the COVID vaccine. Everyone's like, oh, they did it so fast. It's like, yeah, what do you expect? The technology that we have for doing it gets better. Like you wouldn't have the same reaction if someone was like, oh, we brought out the next model computer faster. We kind of expected everywhere else, but for some reason, not necessarily with the vaccine, not to mention the fact that the technology there was actually several decades old. They'd been working on it for a while, which is also what helped them make it so fast. But yeah, it steps up. But yeah, I'll bring Purple's one up.
Yeah. Well, let's answer the question from Intelligent about is the universe water? No.
Well, I was just asking whether referring to it as H2O. But yeah, I'm curious to get your opinion on the question.
Well, the majority of the elements in the universe are hydrogen, with your second most abundant element being helium. The reality is what is out there in the universe is basically those two. Space is not like water. A submarine is not like a rocket ship. Submarines work by using a propeller to move the fluid that it's in from one side of the prop to the other. It's still a form of friction drive. In space, you're using mass ejection to create a forward thrust. It is very different. You have to take your own propellant with you, and then you have to eject it out the back of the ship. So for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, so that you can make the rocket ship move forward. And yeah, it's not the same type of movement at all.
I was kind of thinking of differently, but yeah, that's an interesting take on it. But see, for me, because I've got chemistry background as well, I when someone says water, I'm like, oh, H2O. I'm like, well, the universe is not made of completely of H2O, so my brain immediately went, no. But that, again, that's if you're talking about in more general terms of is space like a fluid, then no. Though you could think of all of space as a sea of energy, and matter is just condensed energy.
But is a sea of energy a fluid? Can you
think not
of
really.
A sea of energy as a fluid?
You're thinking more of, I'm thinking a bit more metaphorically there than in fluid dynamics. So those questions can get quite complicated, which is why cosmologists have jobs.
A more interesting way to think of is like space is filled with magnetic fields. Is the nature of space where you get magnetic fields permeating? Could that be treated like fluid dynamics? Because in some ways, magnetic fields can operate in a similar fashion to fluid dynamics. And we know this because you can use magnetic tethers as forms of for lift and acceleration and things like that. So there are elements where you can use magnetic push and pull effects within magnetic fields to create thrust.
Well, also, if you go back,
interesting aspect.
Yeah, if you go back far enough too in the universe's history, you can get, like, if you're talking really early universe, you can get some really, really funky maths to do with the physics of magnetic fields. But I think that would be a question for someone who is a cosmologist who has a much deeper understanding of that. But you could end up with like magnetic monopoles, because we think of magnetic fields as looped. So you have like a north and south end and the field goes round. Whereas we think of like electrical fields coming out of charges. You can have positive and negative charges, but you can't do that with a magnet. It's linked. But in the early universe, you can get monopoles. So you basically get the equivalent of magnetic charge, but which also would mess up things too. And then, early universe to now, very different. Which also, things get really complicated really quickly too, depending on the question. And it's an interesting. I mean, if we could do it, a warp drive, because I think it's the only way we can make the distances anything close to practical. Because even the ones that are theoretically faster still take a hell of a long time. So one of my favorite examples.
This depends on how you want to look at interstellar drive, though. If you're wanting to look at travel through space within the lifetime of the occupants of the spacecraft, you do not need a warp drive. You do not need to go faster than the speed of light. You just have to travel at a significant proportion of the speed of light, because time dilation then takes care of it for you. So a crew on board a ship that's traveling at 99% of the speed of light, you get from one side of our galaxy to the other in a few years in their frame of reference. But not for anyone on the outside, it will take thousands of years for them to travel.
And when you get there, it'll still take you the speed of light to send any information back. So communication, it takes generations to communicate, even though the people that you sent in the shuttle would get there. But if we're talking about some smaller distances, more near future, I remember listening to a talk one of my lecturers gave, and he was trying to solve a problem with solar sails. I'm not a huge fan of them because you generally power them with lasers, and one of the things that you learn very early in laser physics is that laser beams diverge, they get wider.
Yeah.
Just like most light spreads out, they just do it slower than most. So after a certain distance, the actual force you can apply diminishes. So you end up needing insanely powered lasers, but it is one way to do it.
Also, you have to be able to slow down the ship at the other end, which requires getting there and putting lasers there to slow the ship down.
And so the case study that they looked at, they were only going to solve one problem, but they had to make a few assumptions. And it was, okay, let's think about sending a solar sail powered device, just a satellite, to our nearest star system, which is about 4 light years away. So, and they could travel at about 20% the speed of light. So it's a 20-odd year journey, which is, doable. They were talking about the amount of energy you'd need to speed up a solar sail that was very, very light, because it would have to be. They said that theoretically we could get it up to a speed of 20% the speed of light if your satellite weighs a gram and is about the size of a sultana.
Yeah.
However, he did point out very interestingly that a sultana traveling at 20% the speed of light has the same amount of kinetic energy as an aircraft carrier going 500 kilometers an hour. So it's basically an aircraft carrier flying along at the speed.
And this is, of course, the problem. Like, if you were to try to build a ship that was going to travel at any appreciable speed, proportion of the speed of light, and say we could do that engineering-wise, you hit anything, a speck of dust on your trip across, and space is not empty. It's mostly empty, but it's not empty. If you're going
over a distance that long, you're almost certainly going to hit something.
You're going to hit something.
And
so then you have to look at ways.
Spacecraft might be that big, but the sail's not.
And even if you had shields, physics still works. So even if you had some way of making some sort of shields, momentum is still a thing. You are still going to have a physical impact on the shield, and every impact is going to cost energy from your travel. It's going to cause radiation, and it's probably going to kill the crew of the ship, even if you had shields. So there is this problem that sort of like getting beyond 10% of the speed of light is going to be tricky for us with what we know of physics at the moment and material sciences. Where we just couldn't make anything that would survive it.
Yeah, which is why I like the idea of a warp drive, because
you go out into space.
You have to get around some of those things because you wouldn't need to travel as fast. But then, we don't even know if it's possible. Theoretically it might be, but there's still a lot of uncertainty there, and we know
a lot of energy required too. Though I mean, I think they got it down to get to Alpha Centauri, you'd have to burn the mass of Jupiter.
No, they did refine it further.
Oh, they refined it
their initial
further,
one.
Did they?
They got it down to the entire energy consumption of the US for a full year to power one spacecraft.
That's not too bad, actually.
It's doable. It's in our, but it's at least in the realm of possibility.
But the problem is that's not just the realm
of practicality.
It isn't, because whilst you're saying we need this much energy, not all of that is energy as we know it. Some of that would require negative energy. Now, whilst we've got good scientific evidence to suggest that negative energy exists, i.e. the Kashmir experiment, two plates close together have a repelling force due to a negative energy. We have no way of harnessing anything like negative energy to the extent that you'd have to create a warp field around a spacecraft. Yes, we don't even know how to harness the little bit that we can produce through the Kashmir effect.
Yeah, and also, just in case anyone's not familiar, warp drive. Okay, so you basically do have the speed of light as the speed limit of the universe, and if you have mass, you can never get to the speed of light. You can get exponentially closer, but you'll sort of asymptote close to it, and the energy instead goes to mass. Well, better way, the more refined way of saying it is to momentum. It goes into basically momentum dilation. Most people, but you can also hear about it as mass dilation. The mathematics works out the same, either path you take. It's just most of my professors that study general relativity tell you that it's more formal to use momentum, which is why I've got to use it.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean you can't bend space-time around you. So instead of having you travel at the speed of light, but you basically bend space around so you don't have to go as far. It's the simple explanation. But to do so is not easy.
Alcubierre, I think that's how you say his name, warp drive is basically based around the principle, and this is why you need massive amounts of energy, because energy and mass are interchangeable, is that you push a whole heap of energy or mass, as it were, at the front of the ship, and a whole heap of negative energy, which becomes negative mass at the rear of the ship, so that you compress space-time in front of the ship and then you expand it behind it. You have to do both, or else you're not moving. You have to create that bubble around the ship, and that's basically how it works. And to do, of course, the exchange rate between energy and mass is not in energy's favor. E equals mc squared is not good for us in that sense. It's great for us making energy out of mass, but not good for creating mass from energy.
Good if you want to make a nuclear reactor, but not the other way around.
Not great if you want to create gravitational effects.
No.
So you need a massive amount of concentration of energy.
Not with our current understanding anyway.
Yes, it's not with our current understanding. I mean, we could be wrong.
And there might be other ways to harness energy in the universe, and the chances are there will be. We just nowhere near it. But I do like this one here because this is a very similar effect. If you could make a wormhole, the idea of a wormhole is you basically have space-time and then you bend it round and punch a hole through it. So you take a shortcut. The only thing is that the only way to basically punch that hole or to make a dent in space-time is with something with a lot of gravity. So it's basically something in the close order of a black hole, at least, to do so. So anything you try sending through that wormhole is not going to come out the other side. Not to mention, as Purple has brought up here, the amount of energy you'd need to actually achieve that effect. And by the way, wormholes and warp drives are still only theoretical at this stage. We've got nowhere close to demonstrating any of these in a lab or any setting.
And that's not for the want of trying.
No,
there have been experiments at Lockheed Martin with trying to create small warp fields. Well, things that you'd have to use lab instruments to measure to see if there is a change between. Seeing if we can actually warp space by concentrating energy is basically what they've been working on.
But yeah, it is just not.
It
not
is
easy.
It is at the very basic of levels. We're pretty sure we can do it, but it's going to be. We need. Our biggest problem is energy production. If we ever solved energy production to the point of post-scarcity, these things become not a problem. Pretty much. You've got ways then of getting around the universe if you become a post-scarcity civilization. But for us now, energy creation is, as we've already said, it's a huge problem for us, creating enough energy and doing it so that you don't destroy yourself.
Well, think about how many of the world's problems are related to energy in one way or another. Pretty much all of them. If you have enough energy, there is no problem.
If we could extract energy from the vacuum now, that would be ideal.
That would be cool. And I have heard of some people theorizing that there are possibly ways to do it, but again, it's just theorizing. We're not anywhere close to being particularly practical.
We're just banging heads in a room at the moment.
Yeah, I don't think we would see any of this happening in our lifetime. I know some people are talking about sort of like interstellar space, and then you get the people like Elon Musk. I'm not going too much into that. Who want to talk about, trying to visit other star systems. But I'm actually not sure we'll see that in my lifetime. Not because we wouldn't be physically capable of doing it, but that it's just not practical.
And there's enough to do in our own solar system at the moment.
Any problem we had, we would be better using that energy to fix the problem we had here.
Yeah.
And whilst I'm all for scientific exploration, when the cost of energy is an entire planet, no, there are better scientific endeavors.
The reality is,
it's not that we won't be able to get to other star systems, I think, in my lifetime. I just don't think we'll make it practical enough so it's worthwhile. It's the whole reason we haven't set up colonies on the moon or Mars. We've had the technology to do it for ages. It's just, what's the point? That's the big one, is that we don't get anything out of it. And most of the information that, you can generally just send probes or rovers. And we haven't got a system. I mean, people talk about mining, but it's not like the moon or Mars, particularly the moon, are going to have a composition that's hugely different to Earth, although maybe the positioning of the elements within them would be different. But even if we could mine them, getting it back here is not easy because space flight is still energy-wise
getting it back
expensive.
Here is easier than getting the equipment there to mine it, though.
True. But I should have said I was thinking more of a two-way journey. But
when you're talking about those problems of getting to another solar system and our energy cost and our just scientific cost for it to get to that point, that what we'd have to concentrate into that financially, in energy and everything else, way before we get there, we are in the position of being able to move around our solar system fairly freely in reasonable amounts of time, and that is completely achievable with short-term technology. That is something that we could see in now, maybe not mine, but in Matt's lifetime.
Some of those technologies we still potentially could be talking about years' journey to Pluto and back.
But it would not tens of years.
Although I do like this idea. I haven't actually heard it before, but the idea of bending space-time to basically move Earth using like a wormhole, or I guess possibly based on what we were talking about earlier, maybe a warp drive. I mean, again, if you have enough energy, assuming these theoretical things are actually possible, as the theory suggests, you could. I haven't specifically heard about it. Although, it would actually probably be the only way we can save the Earth from annihilation. I mean, you could always move humanity. It might be more practical to move humanity somewhere else at that point.
There's a brilliant thing that we can do that we almost have the technology to do now. It would just take the will and the money to do it, and it's called solar lifting. And basically what it involves doing is using large magnetic field generators to mine hydrogen and helium off the sun. So basically we decrease the mass of the sun to make it last longer, because the smaller the mass of a star, the longer it continues to burn for. So if you can solar lift, you can not only get fuel for creating energy for yourself, you could also increase the lifespan of your star. And then slightly moving planets around within your solar system is a lot easier than trying to move them to another solar system.
I remember this. I was just on that, moving them around. I remember listening to a talk from Dr. Carl where he was basically answering the question of how many planets can you fit in the Goldilocks system of a star? Because it's not that trivial. Because you think, oh, well, whatever's the diameter, like what's the...
No, because you can't put them in the same orbit.
Yes. So what you actually do is you move a couple of Jupiter-sized planets in there and then turn all of the habitable planets into moons of those bigger planets. So you end up with a system where there's only a few big bodies orbiting, but they have a lot of mini ones orbiting, and you can end up with the limit.
Yeah, because you
can end up with like 100.
If you were to do it here, you'd move Jupiter and Saturn in, and you'd put Earth in orbit around one of those. You put Mars and Jupiter and Venus around one of those, and
then you terraform the larger moons,
and then you terraform. Around. And terraforming is a lot cheaper than moving to another solar system. And then if you've got solar lifting, you can slowly decrease the size of the size of your star, so that you could even get it down to close to being a red dwarf. So it's got trillions of years to last, and just move your planets in. And if you've got the engineering where you can shift planets around, you've got the engineering to stop tidal locking. So no problem. You can make your solar system last a long time.
Yes, and of course, tidal locking doesn't necessarily mean that you'd be tidally locked to the sun either. So
you'd be tidally locked to your large planet.
But you can always manipulate these things to still get pretty much the same atmosphere.
Yeah, you can shift them back to be exactly what you want. You can also manipulate
the atmosphere, and by then, if you got that much energy, you could build shielding or ways and build up smaller satellite systems so that you can control how much radiation reaches the surface. So you'd be able to basically extend or retract the Goldilocks zone, which gives you even more room. And we have about 1 billion years before the sun's radiation will basically fry Earth to a crisp. Yeah. But at that point, the sun still hasn't gone red giant. You still have another 4 billion years after that. I think you've got another 4 or 5 billion years of the sun left. You can just move the planet out of the way, move it further away. So the radiation's less.
Yeah, it's all those things. Because actually shifting a planet within its own solar system and reducing the size of the star so it lasts a bit longer, it doesn't get quite as hot, even moving your solar system. Because if you've got solar lifting, you can use the act of solar lifting from your star to move your solar system, change the velocity of the solar system within the galaxy. That is absolutely brilliant. And these are all things that we could do with maybe a couple of 100 years development in science.
Yeah, we're not close to doing them now.
We're not that close to doing them, but we're a lot closer to doing those than we are to making warp drives and inertial dampeners or any of the things you see in Star Trek.
I don't actually understand inertial dampeners, because there is nothing in physics that suggests they would even be remotely possible, unless it's physically just a big shock absorber. But conservation of momentum is so fundamental that there is no way around it.
Yeah, Mark just asked, how would it affect our orbit if we reduce the size of our star? Our orbit would slowly decay, but it would only decay down to the point where it got to a new stable orbit. So we would actually move in closer to the sun. We just move Earth. And when we just move Earth, if you are solar lifting, you now have the energy resources to move planets.
Yeah.
So these are not problems.
But this is one thing, sort of coming back to earlier, another one why I also don't think, it's another reason is that it's also would be very hard to keep a colony on Mars alive. I think we could do it, but we would need to dedicate so many resources, not practical. And I did hear talks about some of the first ones potentially being one-way trips, where you where you actually expect the people not to be coming back or surviving more than whatever resources they take with them, which would not be much. And yeah, you could extend it by having some like hydroponic labs, but they would not. But you would still be losing a lot of energy. You'd still be losing materials, so they wouldn't last as long as you might think in a long spaceship. It would extend it a bit, but you wouldn't get too far.
We're actually better off building a base on the moon.
Oh, and there was another point brought up by one of my science friends who's now a doctor, like medical doctor. Was
so he's not almost a doctor, he's actually a doctor.
She is actually a doctor.
Sorry.
Yeah. My partner's a doctor as well.
Okay.
Yeah, 2 doctors. They get really nice treatment in banks. That's the only. There's only very few places, if I do actually get the title, where I'm actually going to use it. That might be one of them. But going back to what they're saying is that one of the other problems that you have here is that on those sort of ones, if you've got a limited number of people, what happens if you have a medical emergency? You can't bring a whole hospital with you. And you can't just have one person that's a doctor, because if they're the one that has something happen to them, you're screwed. You'd basically have to, they were saying you'd have to have maybe one doctor and then a few people who are sort of like paramedic trained, and then can also do basic like trauma treatment. And then you would just bring a bunch of broad spectrum antibiotics and other medical things, painkillers, etc., some surgical equipment, and just hope that you don't get any complex problems. But that's another reason why it'd be hard to keep a generational ship alive, unless you could have hundreds of people with a lot of equipment, which is also one thing I do like about Star Trek, is that their spaceships are huge. But that's the only way you could do any long-term space flight. You would need it to be that big to have the facilities to keep the people alive. But yeah, there's no way you could do a generational ship with only like a dozen people. You wouldn't be able to have the expertise to keep them alive. I don't think you would. Not all of them. So yeah, this is also why I don't think we'll be doing it anytime soon.
And even all of our current Mars thing is crazy at the moment. It doesn't make sense. I mean, everything we can learn about getting to other worlds and terraforming them and living on different worlds we can do by going to the moon again, by building a permanent base on the moon somewhere and learning how to live in that. All the science is going to be the same as to living on Mars. So we can learn everything we need to know about doing Mars by going to the and
also, I guess this is also similar if you're using, say, electromagnets to the hydrogen mining. Again, if you've got the energy and the technology to do that, even if it does affect Earth, you'd be able to account for it, because this is all physics that already is quite predictable. The sun's magnetic field isn't, but if we get to the point where we're mining it, we probably will have a better understanding and we can do that. So again, we're making a lot of assumptions that we're going to be scientifically advanced. So I guess the answers to all of this is, don't worry about it. We'll deal with that in the future.
We'll deal with it in a couple of 100 years if we're still here.
You'd be able to, even if there was an effect, you'd be able to predict it. The only effect would be the interaction between the sun's magnetic field and Earth's. But our magnetic field is
but at that
it's not going to affect the orbit by much.
If we can make electromagnetic mining equipment to siphon off gas from the sun,
we can make a bigger one than Earth.
We can make shields that are good enough to overcome problems with our magnetic field. Lagrange points are awesome for that, by the way, because you can put a shield a bit further away from the planet and still protect the entire planet.
I like this one. Just also reminding me of the Monty Python quote, "You better hope there's intelligent life somewhere up in space because there's bug roll down here on Earth." There are some days that I kind of agree with that, but not always. And it depends what's going on at the time. I think purple is also a Star Trek reference, if I get it correctly, because I talk about pre-warp and pre-space flight civilizations.
Yeah.
Well, this was what I was getting to. That's the reason you can't have a small crew, because if you only have like one expert in one field and something goes wrong in that field, or something goes wrong with that expert, you're screwed.
I mean, a great example of that is me here in hospital. My entire medical team that have been trying to figure out what was wrong with me and now what to do with me includes about 20 doctors to deal with one person with a complex issue. You have somebody in space have that. What do? You can't take a CAT scan, an MRI, a PET scan, and all that. You can't take all that equipment with you. Not now. We don't. There's too much weight in all that. And how would you power them? And where are you going to get all the stuff you need to keep running them? So they're going to have limited medical equipment. So how do you do the scans you'd need to find out what was wrong with somebody if they got really sick?
You basically end up needing Star Trek type technology like tricorders, where it's like tiny handheld devices that do the equivalent of all that. And you have like one.
When we have portable handheld MRIs.
I'm not even sure that's possible, because I don't know how you generate a magnetic field that powerful from something that's small.
Not only that, most people don't understand how MRIs work in the first place.
Yeah, they're big for a reason.
Yeah, like the external unit creates your magnetic fields and everything, but it doesn't take pictures. That you are actually lying on the camera, and the magnetic fields are moved in such a way that it triggers the imaging on the camera that you are lying on. The imaging
actually basically comes from what you do is if you have odd atomic mass for a nuclei, and they're normally looking at hydrogen because they're looking at a particular water shift. If you start making it flip, so you know how magnetic fields have a direction, so north-south, you can also in physics normally just do an arrow for it. If you start making the magnetic spin, because we're talking quantum effects now, flip really quickly, you can then interact with using radio waves, and that's basically what you're picking up. An MRI scan is done in, like, the actual camera is a radio camera.
Yeah.
Because you do the same, you do a very similar thing in chemistry, and I've done it. I also teach it as well, because it's in the high school syllabus now, but I also did it all through uni. You basically do the same thing, but to look for different chemicals. But with an MRI scan, you're just looking for that water shift, which is why you sometimes need contrast agents, because you're looking for different densities of water in the body. That's how you make the images that you're looking at. It's also why you can't move, because it takes a while, and it's a very sensitive technique that you don't want much blur. But yeah, doing that in space would be nearly impossible without a huge ship. Again, not impossible. You do it. Although I've seen a couple of questions on inbreeding there's one with generational ships from Mark, and then I think Gigi was talking about one male or one female. The cheetah is a good example of that, because they basically got whittled down to a single breeding pair. And I think I know what you're alluding to, but I'm not going to go into the weeds of where this question normally comes from. But generally speaking, yeah, you wouldn't get past more than a few generations. It's also the reason why the Egyptian dynasties never lasted very long, because the pharaoh, his main wife, would always be his sister. So they never got very far either. However, if you were careful in how you selected a small group of people, you could choose them that the genetic diversity between them was enough to get you a few generations. But if you were going to another planet, you would need to top it up. There is a minimum level. But another example of how, even though, yes, things like cheetahs can get away with it if you're lucky, even a bigger population can still be lethal. The last population of woolly mammoths to existed on an island off the north coast of Siberia. And they reckon that the numbers that got there was in the order of a few hundred, maybe 1,000 or so. And they survived long enough to have seen the building of the Great Pyramids had they been able to get there. So when the pyramids were built, mammoths are still around. I've heard people say the year zero, they were still around, but that's a myth. I don't think they were. Oh no, maybe not the pyramids either. They were still around to see the first human cities, but it was very, very early human civilization. But they were doomed to
mammoths
failure.
That were in one of the islands of Siberia lasted a lot longer.
Yeah, they did, but they didn't reach year zero, but they did reach into basically early human cities. So you had modern civilization around when mammoths were still roaming. And the reason they survived on that island, or one of the reasons that helped them,
they were smaller to start with.
Yeah, they were slightly smaller, but like when we talk about woolly mammoths, we're not necessarily.
No, they were
like when you're talking about mammoths, you're not talking about one species. You're talking about many different.
No, there were many. Yeah, the pygmy mammoths were a particular species.
Yeah, so, the current two species of elephant are more closely related to woolly mammoths than they are to each other, because basically the elephant. Sorry, I forget the formal clade name. Maybe someone in the chat can remember, if you can, Jen, what it is.
Pachyderm?
There could be. Again, I guess it depends how high up you want to go. Is huge, but the species that went there was still in, as I said, in the order of maybe about 1,000 or at least a few hundred. I'd have to recheck the sources exactly how many, but like we're talking hundreds at least. And the few fossils and preserved remains they've found of them, although they're not technically fossils because they're not all 10,000 years old, but the remains they found, the genetic markers they've got in them show that a lot of them were suffering genetic conditions. So that population was too inbred, despite the numbers. So again, it's not this many people will give you inbreeding in this many generations. You have to be more careful than that. But yeah, that's also another one where you would have to be careful with generationships. So I don't think it'd be worth trying to move small colonies elsewhere, because you'd still need constant back and forward until you get that quickly. There's no point. I'm with you, Jen. I think if we have the ability to do that, we can just fix whatever problem we're facing.
Yeah. GG, with what happened to this story about remaking mammoths. It's interesting, mammoths, because of the number of mammoths that we found frozen in permafrost. We have actually been able to sequence most of their DNA. So technically, you could start with an elephant and re-engineer a mammoth. And because they're actually one of the easier ones. An elephant could gestate a mammoth. So you could do it. You probably wouldn't have the mammoth that we had. You'd have something very close to the mammoths that were around. We'd basically be reintroducing mammoth-like traits to an elephant.
That's interesting, because they are actually doing that, but not with mammoths, but with basically the precursors to, I believe it's cows, or it's certain cattle, where they're trying to rebreed the old sort of Ice Age ancestor to release back into the environment to help like natural control. It's the easiest process if you've got genetic markers left in current animals, is known as backbreeding, where you selectively breed to bring back the traits from those genetic markers until you end up with the original animal. So you could actually backbreed humans over enough generations and get Neanderthals again, because we have their genome spread out very loosely. However, that wouldn't be ethical in humans, so you can do it in some other animals. If you don't have animals with current genetic with enough genetic material of that animal, then yeah, you would have to probably lift it from fossils if you can. But based on the calculated half-lives of DNA under more ideal preservation scenarios, gives you a rough range of about 2 to 2.5 million years before a genome is impossible to obtain.
Yeah, which is why mammoths are the ideal candidate.
Understandings. And so I know there's been, over the last couple of decades, the whole thing about like the soft tissue in dinosaur fossils and finding traces of DNA, etc. They've never found DNA, and the soft fossils was like these sort of soft things are only softened because they were generally put in acid baths for a long time. They're not anything close to being able to do a Jurassic Park. We just can't. Unfortunately, chemistry is going to mean we can't do a Jurassic Park. Closest thing you're going to get to that is to go to an Avery.
Yeah, we could technically. We could technically turn some traits on and off in some birds to make...
And get dinosaur-like things, but they would not be genetically dinosaurs. The original one. We would basically just be modifying current animals to look more like, or have the same traits as close cousins that lived a long time ago. Because birds are fairly similar to raptors, so I can see you doing that. I mean, it wouldn't be hard to go from an emu to a raptor.
No. You could probably create something that looked. You could probably create something that looked a lot like a velociraptor. And remember, velociraptors aren't like they were in Jurassic Park. They are quite small.
Yeah.
They're not much bigger than a turkey.
And they were feathered. Yeah, you could pick one up and give you a hug. It'd probably give you a nasty scratch, but it's not... a very in a fight, you would win. Even against a number of them, you'd probably win because you just stand back and kick them. Yeah. Not that I'm suggesting you do it, because chances are they're not going to come near you. If you look at the behavior of most modern birds...
to be quite honest, if we re-engineered velociraptors from turkeys or something similar, I think most people would be very disappointed.
Yeah,
because they'd be expecting
they wouldn't be the
like
big Jurassic Park things. Yeah, but anyway, the Jurassic Park novel, they're not velociraptors.
No,
They're another larger dromaeosaur.
Yeah,
which is why they're so big in Jurassic Park. But and also to be fair to the original Jurassic Park, the understanding of how widespread feathers were in dinosaurs was not yet established. So it was only just starting, and it was still fairly speculative.
And to be fair,
however, by
the movie
later
has
one,
the
we knew it.
but the movie made the excuse that because they re-engineered them, and they
but those were later
like
movies.
what they. Yes, but that's what the excuse was in later movies.
Yeah,
because we re-engineered
which is stupid. Because, and the genetic, the animals they say they used, it was like frog to fill in the gap because you think of the reptiles. I'm like, no, you use a bird.
Yeah,
of some kind because they're closer.
But you've got to remember, at the time it was written, there were still arguments in academia whether birds were related to.
Yeah, but again,
the raptor
that's
dinosaurs.
The first Jurassic Park. By the time you get to the later ones, and especially by the time you get to the Jurassic World, the new remakes, that was not a question that anyone was asking. No. That was already established. We know that most dinosaurs, particularly the raptors, were fluffy, not T-Rex, because we found so many well-preserved skin fragments that suggest that at least at fully sized, they were not feathered, despite the fact that other tyrannosaurs were. So
they still think they had a bit of down on them for warmth, though. Just not feathered, but just like a thin layer of downing on some of them.
Some of it was very, very primitive. It was known as dino fuzz.
Dino fuzz,
but no, it looks like T-Rexes were not fluffy. They may have had a few display quills, but their general skin was not. Whereas most dinosaurs had some kind of feathers, particularly because the really early, the general ancestors, or at least the fossils we've had of species that are indicative of the common ancestor of most dinosaurs, had some kind of fuzz to them. And yes, it is called dino fuzz. So there we go. Fluffy dinosaurs. So yeah, that was
I like how Mark's going on that we should try for a long stream when we've been going 2.5 hours.
Yes, I will have to finish up soon. I'll see if we can finish up the half past because I need to get ready for work.
Yeah. And I will have nurses come around wanting to do obs soon. So,
Oh yeah, and then Purple's comment too. Yeah, I think they just did it as an excuse because they had the understanding that frogs can change gender or something, and that's why the dinosaurs can breed. I think it was
some
a very
lizards do that too.
Yeah,
not so much change gender. It was being able to reproduce asexually, but because there are some frogs that can do that.
Oh, okay. So yeah, because it was something about the dinosaurs started reproducing and they weren't meant to, but it was very ad hoc because there's other ways to do it.
But there are actually lizards that do that, reproduce asexually if there are no males.
Oh, okay.
Around. So they didn't need to use frogs at all,
which is weird because the original Jurassic Park, other than that, actually for the most part listened to their science advisor, like the science communicator that they had, who's basically consulting with them. They actually listened to him a fair bit. As I said, they got more right than other movies at the time. It was just the science changed so much by the third movie that it was all outdated. But yeah, there are bits like that are just, no, it's just an ad hoc rationalization as to how they made them. And I don't think people actually really knew what they're talking about. But I've seen other movies that are even worse. But yeah, the modern ones are even, like the newer ones are even worse in terms of accuracy. Like a mosasaur that's like, 100 meters long? And you're like, no. Yeah, there were some ichthyosaurs that may have rivaled the size of blue whales and potentially even been a bit bigger. Maybe, very big maybe, because the studies that looked at it had to do extrapolations and based on certain bones. So it's only a fragment of a bone and it's a very big guess. So there's a lot of huge error bar on it. But
to be fair, the megalodon is way more. The megalodon, the giant shark, is way more scary than the mosasaur.
Yes, particularly if you look at its hunting habits. The megalodon actually based on the fact that we found its teeth in certain early whale fossils, most likely hunted by ramming its prey to crush their ribs and then bite off like flippers and tails to basically immobilize them.
And like great whites, they could come into shallows. So, yeah.
You're not really safe anywhere. But the reason that they reckon that Megalodon went extinct, or one of them, was actually competition from smaller sharks like great whites. And you see that when Megalodons start to go extinct is when whales finally get bigger. They're actually much smaller. You didn't have anything close to like a blue whale. You did have Basilosaurus, which is a terrible name because it was not a serpent or a basilisk of any kind, but it was just a toothed giant carnivorous whale. But it also went extinct because the ice caps formed. Antarctica and the Arctic didn't have permanent ice, and then they did, and so it disappeared too. Well, I think 20% of all water species disappeared at that point, but it's not a mass extinction. Those are worse. Sorry, Oh yeah, so I think Purple, when you're talking about the teeth, you're talking about the sharks. So they're not actually even sure exactly what clade of shark Megalodon is, which makes its size a bit more variable. And they're not entirely sure what it looks like. Because originally it was always depicted as looking like a giant great white, but there is some evidence to suggest that it may not have. It might have had a more stocky, shorter face, like shorter nosed build to it. But all they know is a very, very vicious one. Whereas when I'm talking like the ichthyosaur, I don't know. I don't think they had. Oh no, they did have teeth, but it's normally from fragments of skulls or other parts. So I don't think it's teeth, but it's other ones. 7-inch penguins in New Zealand. Though there used to be
7 foot.
7 foot. Sorry. Yes, there used to be giant, like 3-meter penguins too. Currently, the biggest ones is emperor penguins. They're a meter tall, but we used to have like 2-3 meter ones. I think they used to be a lot bigger. Most current existing clades of life have had much bigger versions in the past. That all disappeared. If you're talking mammals and more modern things, so after the dinosaur extinction, most of the biggest ones all went extinct about 50,000 years ago.
Yes,
or at the end of the last ice age.
There is recent evidence to suggest the Earth passes through an area where there was a smaller nova, not a supernova, but a nova where you've got one a dwarf star orbiting a larger star and pulling off, and it reaches the Chandra limit, and because
basically mini star explosions.
So there's a particular element in the Earth's layer, and I can't remember what it was because I was reading this the other day and now I've forgotten most of it, that shows up at about that boundary where we started losing our megafauna.
Oh, that's interesting, because the radiation may have affected the bigger ones a bit more than the smaller ones.
That was their point. They think that the radiation hit, which would have damaged our ozone layer, was more decimating to the larger animals that existed at the time than it was to smaller animals. So...
And bigger animals tend to have slower gestation. They reproduce much slower. So a smaller effect will hit them harder than it would for smaller creatures that, on average, or at least general correlation, they tend to reproduce faster. Because humans, apes are an odd one out. Most creatures our size reproduce much faster.
So our early ancestors were in an area where they got to see a nova as brighter in the sky than a full moon.
I kind of a bit envious of them, but also
I'm not
at the same time,
because I don't know what to, when you're talking.
I'm only envious in that it would have looked good, but in other facts, I'm like, no, we don't need that because it's not going to look big to be
that's
very
not
nice.
Going to be good.
No, and here's another one. So the Earth's mass extinctions. Mark Caesar's asking if it's Nova 93. Oh, yeah. I said that aloud and realized no. Okay, good, nice joke though. The Earth's mass extinctions actually have a cycle to them, a rough time cycle, and it coincides because the Earth's orbit around the Milky Way, or as it goes around, it takes too long to complete a full circle, so it's not that. But as it goes around, it's not completely on a flat plane, the Earth does wobble up and down, and every 130 million years or something, kind of, I don't remember the exact cycle, but it roughly syncs up with mass extinctions. It passes through a band of more concentrated dark matter. So you end up with a slight bit more gravitational pull around the solar system as it passes through. And that seems to be why you tend to end up with these mass extinctions, because a lot of them have to do with some kind of
impact
astronomical event, particularly meteorites. So you always hear like the KT, the non-avian dinosaur extinction, which is the most famous, being a meteorite impact. But the biggest one, the Permian Triassic extinction, the PT, or the Great Dying, which was worse, way, way worse in terms of what it did to culling Earth's basically biodiversity, was basically the eruption of basically a volcanic eruption the size of Siberia. The Siberian traps just detonate. But I've heard some people theorize that the reason that occurred was because a meteorite smacked into the Earth on the other side, and the shockwave was what caused that to go. It's harder to distinguish that, and there's evidence to suggest that some of the other big events in at least geological history were actually probably the result of something fairly big smacking the Earth. And it does roughly coincide with that cycle of when we pass through an area that's a bit denser, so we're more likely to have flying debris get attracted to the solar system. Again, it's not a perfect correlation, but it suggests that we're not I can't remember. I can't remember when we're due for one next. But yeah, so it could be that astronomy is the reason why we keep having mass extinctions, which shouldn't be too much for surprise.
That doesn't mean you should blame astronomers.
Yes. Oh, by the way, just to make it clear, Mark, just looking at your comment, it's not that the dark matter's moving, it's just the sort of solar system as it's orbiting the galaxy center. It does wobble a bit. So if you're thinking about the plane that we orbit, we kind of go up and down a bit. And there is sort of a more dense region of dark matter that we seem to pass through. Again, a lot of this is still fairly speculative.
Well, yeah, our solar system is currently traveling through a bubble of less density. So we are actually in a space that not only has less dark matter, but it also has less baryonic. God, Bennett can't say the word.
Baryonic matter, yeah, because if there's less dark matter, you're less likely to have baryonic matter because it's going to be pulled towards the dark matter. It's actually one of the things that helps form galaxies is
we're basically in this big bubble with a lot less matter than anywhere else. So it's kind of cool.
I think, Gigi, you're talking about the Milankovitch cycles, which is a different one, which cycles on, I think, more the order of tens of thousands of years. So that's a different one, and that's actually a linking of several cycles, including solar activity, the Earth's tilt, and a few other things.
The obliqueness of its orbit as well.
About a much longer sort of 100, like tens or 100 million years cycle. This one is tens of thousands, and I've heard
it's usually the causes of cooling and warming periods.
Yeah, like minor ones, but it is, and it's also and that sort of cycle is noticeable on shorter term things like the distribution of woolly mammoths towards the end of the last glacial period, because you actually see periods of them being spread out, and then in isolated pockets up at higher altitudes because it warmed and they had to move to the colder places. Then it cools again, and then they spread back out, and then it warms again, so you can actually see that one. It's quite. But it's easy to predict. Those cycles are actually fairly predictable.
The interesting thing about that, when we're talking about our current climate change, is that we are technically in a cooling cycle, but our global temperatures are getting warmer. So that just shows how much we've screwed things up.
And I've heard people try and say, the sun, or have they, and they talk as though scientists have not accounted for all these other factors with global warming. It's like, no, they have. We've known about them for a long time, and we can predict them really well, and we can tell that they're not responsible for this warming. We know what's causing the warming. That's not hard. And if anyone wants to argue that it's not us that is dumping so much CO2 in the air, we can do isotope analysis to figure out where that carbon in the carbon dioxide is coming from. So again, we can prove that it's us.
And if anyone's wondering about the extra aurora we're getting at the moment, that is because our sun's not only in its most active period, it's one of the most active periods it's had in the last 50 years. So there's a lot of prominences. There's a lot of there's been several coronal mass ejections. None of them have completely directed us. Yeah, there was. It hit us, but it didn't directly hit us. Yeah, and there was even a tornado spotted on the northern pole of the sun, which is something we've never seen before. A tornado.
I got to look into that because that is really cool. I knew about the big one. Also, I did want to bring this one up because this is a good one, because Gigi was talking about 2 to 3 scientists who are still skeptical and pointing out that it's just more about picky things. Yeah, normally when you hear science, generally speaking, yes, there's always exceptions because you get that. That's unavoidable. Generally speaking, when you talk about scientific disagreements over things like climate change, it's not over anthropogenic climate change. It's about particular factors. But unfortunately, that nuance is often lost accidentally or deliberately. Both play a part. I'm not saying it's one or the other. It is both. That nuance gets lost, and when that gets presented in a more public media, it gets portrayed as this scientist is skeptical of all of it. I remember an interview, and it was on Sky News. Don't ask why it was there. I wasn't the one who chose to have Sky News on, where they were interviewing a scientist from a Queensland university who had been fired after he tried to point out that about 7 of their major studies on the Great Barrier Reef were incredibly flawed. And it turns out he was correct. But he was just pointing out that the methodologies and the findings of these 7 studies was flawed. And the people interviewing them, the news reporters, were trying to get him to make a statement. So where basically it went from these particular very specific studies on certain fish species and their impact in the Great Barrier Reef due to climate change is flawed to, so that means we can't trust climate change at all. And this scientist, and you could tell they wanted him to say, yeah, it means we can't trust any of it. But fortunately, he was a good scientist and he said, no, it just means these ones are flawed. Climate change, we know it. It was basically like, no, we know climate change is a problem. It was just, my problem is only with these ones. And so I had a lot of respect for him. And you could almost see the pained look on the news reporters' faces as they were, because they wanted that line. They wanted to make this whole, because I mean, Sky News is pretty notorious for being anti-scientific when it comes to climate change, or at least from what I've seen of them. And they just wanted that statement, but they didn't get it. And I'm glad, but that doesn't always happen. You don't always have someone there who can turn around and point out that most of the time it's this tiny little nuance. You also, I mean, yes, science journalists, Gigi, are generally a better news, but you have to be careful because there's, like, I've heard some professors argue that to be a good science journalist, you need a PhD, not because you need that level of science to present it to the general public, but because you need that level of practice to understand how complex the scientific process is. I'm not sure I fully agree, but I definitely see their point, and I can see why we probably need more people with PhD levels of experience, though they don't necessarily need a PhD, even masters, but like high-end several year-long projects in science who understand just how, like, the nuances and how long it takes to get a study. I think we need more people like that as science journalists, because in any case, you would be correct. Because a lot of the time is that a lot of these science journalists, if they're working for a bigger company that wants them to publish quickly, they don't have the time to do the research. So a lot of the time, a lot of the nuance is missed, unfortunately, and that does play a part.
Did you answer Purple's question? About the Northern Lights.
I think you were answering that one.
I was going to. What I was going to say is, you probably missed it, Purple, but during the last CME that grazed our planet, the aurora borealis was visible already in the northern hemisphere. So that's how active our sun's been at the moment.
It's quite cool.
It's kind of scary, actually, because if we get hit by one straight on, we're going to have major problems.
Yeah, we'll lose most of our electronics. Or we'll lose anything in orbit is going to get fried. Unless it's in, because I don't think that'd be like if it's big enough, doesn't matter how much you try and insulate it, it's gone. And it would be like
our biggest problem on
EMP
Earth is
blast.
that our power distribution systems aren't designed to cope with it. That's our biggest problem, more so than a little bit of EM pulse build up in, say, your laptop or whatever. Your bigger problem is the surges that will happen through the mains, because our grid systems around the world do not have the right sort of insulating systems to stop large surges that we get with a CME hitting the planet. And that's the problem. If you unplug your computer,
we haven't built anything to be prepared for it, which is weird because the scientists have been saying, yeah, we're due for one eventually.
Yeah. And we were really close last week.
And the thing is, we can't predict them very well. We can predict general activity with some accuracy, but unfortunately, there's a lot going on inside the sun that we just don't know about that makes it very hard to predict. Like the magnetic field of the sun is insanely erratic and crazy and complex, and that does play a big part. So trying to predict in advance when we're going to get hit by a mass ejection is next to impossible at this stage.
I mean, the notification we have for that CME was about 8 hours.
Yeah.
We saw it building. We thought it was going to hit us. They actually really thought we were going to cop the main thing of it. That there was thoughts that,
most of it got swallowed offline again by the sun.
Yeah.
It didn't quite escape,
and it wasn't exactly at us either, which was
it did miss
really good. It was a near miss. So you've got to so if you've got 8 hours, what do you do? How do you shut down everything to make sure we don't lose everything? Personally, if you hear that's going to happen, go and unplug everything you want to keep.
Sorry?
Go and unplug anything you want to keep for a start.
Probably, but then again, you may not have an electrical grid for a while to use it with.
Yeah, that's true.
Yes. Basically, flip the main isolator switch on your switchboard. Like go to the fuse box. I mean, most of them are not fuses anymore. And isolate your house, because otherwise, I'd flick.
But even then, the wires in your house could pick up and unplug everything too.
Yeah, but that would be my first go-to, because again, if you don't have much warning,
you don't have long.
Take the biggest steps first, and then you can go and do the specifics. But
we need to have a really, really large CME for your laptop just to be fried by sitting on your desk. That would be larger than what we'd normally expect, even to see from our sun. But enough that we get superchargers in the grid that could burn out anything plugged in. Yeah, that can happen, definitely.
And this is not
take
new.
Out the grid.
Scientists have been warning about that possibility.
Well, it already happened across North America.
I don't think we just haven't had a big enough one that'll scare everyone into action, because unfortunately,
I'm trying to remember. My brain keeps thinking about the Carrington event, but that was pre that. But the Carrington event took out all the telecommunications that we had at the time, which was mostly Morse code, but
which is a bit easier to replace too.
Which was a bit easier to get up and running again, because it wasn't as sophisticated. But if we got that one now, that you'd have this thing blackouts around the world and days, maybe weeks to get everything back up and running.
Yeah, I'm just hoping that we have that. A few hours warning will be enough for a city to be able to shut down its power grid, and hope that it's enough to not blow everything. You're going to lose something, but hopefully you can keep enough of it that it's enough redundancy is there that you don't lose everything. Because
the big problem's going to be
the communication.
The big problem is going to be the big transformers that they use at junction stations, because they'll get hit and they will burn out. Yeah, they get hit and they burn out, and you've got to replace them. But if you can take them offline, they're less likely to burn out, so they might be able to get it back up and running.
Is that the one you're referring to?
Yeah. It wasn't just New York; it was quite a sizable chunk of the eastern seaboard that got knocked out, and that was a CME that grazed the planet as well. So
yeah, it wasn't as big as it could get.
No, but the Carrington was an event where we actually did get hit by a smaller CME, but straight on. That was in the 1800s.
Yeah, I was thinking of you still looking mainly just telegraphs, because then at least if you lose your electrical grid, it's not essential for much. Not back then.
All of the US grid east of Ohio.
Yeah,
basically pretty much it. And the Carrington was bigger. And Carrington is probably the Carrington event is something we're looking at. We will probably we're overdue for. Basically, we've been really lucky.
We'll probably actually get to see one in our lifetimes, and I'm not happy about that.
Well, technically, the last ejection, even with most of it being reabsorbed by the sun, would have been big enough to have a Carrington.
But a lot of them do get at least partially reabsorbed anyway, just because.
Yeah, and a lot of them are not aimed at us, because they have to basically be directly aimed at us. Getting the tail edges of an event, by the time it gets here, it's that spread out that it's not as bad. But if you get it straight on,
but it happens often enough and in enough directions, and by straight on, it's still a very wide beam. I mean, beam's the wrong word, but it's still a very wide phenomena.
Yeah, because the
wide burst of
the flares are already shaped as an arc because it follows the magnetic lines. So when they burst and they throw out, some of it's pulled back in, and the bit that's on the edge is what's thrown out. Up in the top at the end of it, and that expands as it goes out. But what's the central part of it is the bit that expands the slowest. So if it's aimed directly at you, you get more particles, and it's the number of particles that hit these what causes the problem.
Yeah, and when those particles hit our magnetic field, which is what protects us from them, it still makes an basically big electrical field that gives us the shock and the surges that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Because every time you accelerate a charged particle, you generate an electric field. It's how the synchrotron earlier I was talking about works. Remember, you get an electron, you make it wobble. Well, now imagine doing that in so many places you just get these burst of radiations that hits Earth. Yeah.
Coming up on 3 hours here, Matt. We're doing well.
Yes, we are. I unfortunately will have to probably head off soon. So I'm going to ask for any final questions that we will answer briefly and hopefully not go down too many tangents. And hopefully everyone who is watching, who was watching, and who will watch afterwards has had some fun. If you've survived all the way through, that's impressive because, we are coming up not far off 3 hours, a longer one. But
this is one of the longest streams I think we've done.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've got to go back to the chat we have.
Got to provide.
I think we've got to go back to the chat we have with Tessa to have a longer one.
Yeah, but then we had a chat first, and then Tessa came on. And we almost came on.
Yes, so that's why it was so long.
Extension,
yes.
Yeah, but that was cool. I mean, she was an astrobiologist.
Yeah, she would have enjoyed today's conversation actually.
Anyway, do you have any last comments, Jen? And as I said, if there's any last comments,
I think we've covered so much. It's been really interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to do a summary of that because we've gone from lasers to chemical warfare to mass extinctions to galactic travel to solving some of the world's problems, creating some more problems, and then getting hit by the sun when it has a hissy fit.
Okay. I think that about sums it up, Matt.
Anyway, thanks everyone for watching. Thanks very much, Jen, for joining. I hope you're feeling better soon.
I really enjoyed this.
But yeah, I am going to throw us out as soon as I can remember where the right button is. But yes, remember, I'm almost a doctor, and until next time, be like a proton, stay positive.